for the brutal and calculated murder of 3 children. This court has no mercy. You are both hereby sentenced to 150 years in prison.
On September 18, 2023, in Savannah, Georgia, 3 children, William Barley, Daniel Barley, and Sophia Barley, were murdered by their teenage parents, 19-year-olds Jason Barley and Olivia Smith, who drugged and then suffocated them in their beds. The crime occurred in a small rental house on the outskirts of the historic district where the young family lived in increasingly squalid conditions despite the charming facade of the neighborhood. Neighbors would later recall hearing music and laughter from the couple earlier that evening, sounds that seemed innocently festive at the time, but would take on a chilling significance as the investigation unfolded. What initially appeared as a tragic home invasion would soon be revealed as something far more calculated and disturbing, the methodical elimination of 3 children by the very people who should have protected them at all costs. Before we continue with this horrific case, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, so drop your location in the comments below. If you find this case as disturbing as I do, please consider subscribing to support our continued coverage of important true crime stories like this one. The Barley-Smith household had long been a place of neglect, hidden behind closed doors, with the children often left to fend for themselves while their parents pursued a lifestyle of partying and substance abuse. On that fateful Monday evening, the couple executed a plan they had been meticulously crafting for weeks, beginning by mixing a powerful combination of crushed sleeping pills into the children's dinner. Text messages recovered later would show Jason messaging Olivia at 6:13 p.m. that evening. "Did you crush them fine enough? They need to be out completely." The couple waited until the children were unconscious before moving to each bedroom, placing pillows over their faces and suffocating them one by one, starting with the youngest, Sophia. After ensuring the children were dead, Jason and Olivia carefully staged a break-in, overturning furniture, breaking a back window from the outside, and removing some electronics and jewelry from the home. They then drove to a popular nightclub in downtown Savannah, making sure to be visible to many witnesses and appearing on security cameras at 9:47 p.m., establishing what they believed would be an airtight alibi. The couple spent 3 hours drinking and dancing, periodically posting selfies on social media with captions like, "Finally free for a night out," "Party time," and "Best night in forever, no responsibilities." At precisely 1:18 a.m., they returned home and placed a frantic 911 call, reporting a break-in and their discovery of their children's bodies, their performances as devastated parents beginning the moment the dispatcher answered. The initial response by Savannah police was massive, with the first officers arriving at the scene within 4 minutes of the call to find Olivia sobbing on the front lawn while Jason paced and appeared to be in shock. Body camera footage from Officer Terrence Reynolds captured the couple's initial statements, with Olivia crying, "Someone broke in and killed my babies. Who would do this to children?" Jason appeared unable to speak coherently, repeatedly saying, "They're gone. They're all gone," while avoiding eye contact with officers. Detective Andre Wilson, arriving 30 minutes later to lead the investigation, would later testify that his suspicions were immediately raised by the unusual neatness of the children's bodies, which appeared to have been carefully arranged in sleeping positions despite the supposedly violent break-in that had occurred around them. The tranquil streets of Savannah's outlying neighborhood, normally filled with the scent of magnolias and the distant sounds of tourists in the historic district, were now crowded with police vehicles, their red and blue lights reflecting off the historic architecture and casting eerie shadows. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the small house, photographing and collecting evidence, while neighbors gathered behind yellow police tape, many in bathrobes and pajamas, whispering about the young family that had always seemed a bit out of place in their tightly knit community. Local news crews arrived before dawn, broadcasting the first reports of what they described as a tragic home invasion that claimed the lives of 3 young children while their parents were out for the evening. The initial public reaction was one of horror and sympathy for the teenage parents who had, as one early news report put it, lost everything in a senseless act of violence that has shaken this quiet Savannah neighborhood to its core. Jason and Olivia were separated and interviewed at the scene, their statements initially aligning in a way that would later be revealed as rehearsed. Both claimed they had decided to have a rare night out together, leaving at around 9:30 p.m. after putting the children to bed and returning just after 1 a.m. to find their home ransacked and their children unresponsive. When asked why they had not arranged for a babysitter, Olivia explained that the children were good at taking care of themselves, and that 8-year-old William knew to call 911 in an emergency. Jason added that they checked on the kids all the time by text, though investigators would later find no evidence of such texts on William's prepaid phone, which contained only unanswered messages asking his parents when they would be home. The bodies of William, Daniel, and Sophia were removed from the home as dawn broke over Savannah's oak-lined streets, the medical examiner's van driving slowly past news cameras and a growing memorial of stuffed animals and candles placed by community members. Inside the home, evidence technicians were making the first of many troubling discoveries. Despite the apparent robbery, valuable electronics had been left behind. The broken window showed signs of being broken from the outside after it was already unlocked, and most puzzlingly, there were no signs of struggle or disturbance in the children's rooms. Most significantly, preliminary examinations by the medical examiner at the scene indicated the children had likely been deceased for several hours before the reported break-in, a critical timeline discrepancy that Detective Wilson immediately flagged for further investigation. The case that had begun as an apparent home invasion was already showing the first cracks in its facade, revealing glimpses of a truth far more disturbing than anyone in the sleepy Savannah neighborhood could have imagined. As the day progressed, Jason and Olivia were kept separate at the police station, ostensibly to provide comfort and support while detectives continued their investigation, but increasingly to observe discrepancies in their accounts. Initially maintaining a convincing display of grief, Olivia was observed by a female officer briefly checking her phone for social media reactions when she thought no one was watching, while Jason repeatedly asked when they could get out of here to make funeral arrangements. By late afternoon, with the couple still unaware of the timeline inconsistencies identified by the medical examiner, Detective Wilson obtained warrants for their phones based on standard procedure for eliminating suspects. What he would find in those devices would transform a suspicious case into something far more sinister, revealing a premeditation so cold-blooded that even veteran investigators would be shaken by its implications. The historic city of Savannah, known for its genteel charm and Spanish moss-draped squares, has seen its share of tragedies in its long history. But the deaths of the Barley children struck a particular chord in a community that prides itself on traditional values and family bonds. As evening fell on September 19th, just one day after the murders, candlelight vigils were organized in the city's famous Forsyth Park, where hundreds gathered to mourn 3 children few had known in life. Local news coverage focused on the senseless tragedy and the young parents facing unimaginable loss, narratives that would dramatically shift in the days to come. Behind the scenes, in the Savannah Police Department's forensic lab, technicians were already uncovering the first pieces of digital evidence that would contradict everything Jason and Olivia had claimed, beginning with text messages exchanged 2 weeks before the murders in which Olivia wrote to Jason, "I can't take another day of this. 3 kids was never the plan. We're too young for this life." The contrast between the public perception and emerging reality created a mounting tension within the investigation team. While maintaining the appearance of supporting the grieving parents, detectives were quietly building a case against them, collecting statements from neighbors who reported frequent loud parties when the children were home alone and documenting the neglected state of the home, including nearly empty refrigerators and children's bedrooms that lacked basic necessities. The autopsy reports, expedited due to the high-profile nature of the case, delivered the first definitive contradiction to the parents' story. Toxicology results showed high levels of sedatives in all three children's systems, substances not consistent with normal medication but matching prescription sleeping pills found in Olivia's purse. Most damning was the estimated time of death, placed between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., well before Jason and Olivia claimed to have left for their night out, directly contradicting their carefully constructed timeline and alibi. William Barley, at just 8 years old, had already developed the watchful eyes and protective instincts of someone far beyond his years, a small boy who carried the weight of responsibility for his younger siblings on narrow shoulders that should have been unburdened by such adult concerns. School records would reveal a bright child who excelled at math and science despite frequent absences and obvious signs of neglect, with teachers noting that he often appeared tired and hungry, but would always ensure his younger siblings had whatever food was available before eating himself. William's third-grade teacher, Ms. Rebecca Thornton, would later testify that he once explained his frequent tardiness by saying, "Sometimes I have to make breakfast for Daniel and Sophia, and it takes a long time because I'm not tall enough to reach the stove good," a statement that prompted her to make the first of several calls to Child Protective Services that somehow never resulted in meaningful intervention. In a tragic twist that investigators would uncover months later, William had started a small notebook where he kept a careful record of the times his parents left them alone, writing in childish block letters, "Mom and Dad gone again. I will protect D and S until they come back." Daniel, the middle child at 7 years old, was remembered by neighbors as the most outgoing of the three siblings, a boy with an infectious laugh who would wave enthusiastically to anyone who passed by their small rental house. His second-grade teacher described him as perpetually optimistic despite obvious challenges at home, noting that he would create elaborate stories about adventures he planned to take his siblings on someday, tales filled with heroes and happy endings that served as an escape from their difficult reality. Unlike his more serious older brother, Daniel maintained a child's natural joy and curiosity, collecting interesting rocks and leaves that he stored in a shoebox under his bed, treasures that police would later photograph as part of the crime scene. The contents of his school backpack, cataloged as evidence, included carefully wrapped portions of his school lunches that investigators determined he was saving to bring home to his 5-year-old sister, a small act of kindness that spoke volumes about the bonds between the siblings. Little Sophia, just 5 years old and the only daughter, was described by her kindergarten teacher as a tiny old soul who rarely spoke but observed everything with intelligent, wary eyes that seemed to evaluate whether adults could be trusted. With dark curls often hastily pulled into uneven ponytails, done by William as police would later learn, Sophia had only started kindergarten a month before her death and was still adjusting to school routines, often clinging to her brothers during drop-off and pickup times. The director of her after-school program noted that unlike other children who ran to greet their parents, Sophia and her brothers often seemed tense when Jason or Olivia arrived, whispering urgently to each other before gathering their things with an efficiency that spoke of practiced routine rather than childish excitement to go home. In the last parent-teacher conference before her death, her teacher had noted concerns about possible developmental delays, likely stemming from lack of stimulation and engagement at home, but also remarked on her extraordinary resilience and the strong bond she shared with her brothers. The Barley children lived in a small, three-bedroom rental house that belied the historic charm of the surrounding Savannah neighborhood, its peeling paint and sagging porch standing in stark contrast to the well-maintained historic homes nearby. Neighbors would later tell investigators that the children were frequently seen playing unsupervised in the small, untended yard, often until well after dark, with 8-year-old William clearly in charge of his younger siblings. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, an elderly neighbor who lived across the street, told detectives those poor babies were raising themselves, plain and simple. Many mornings I'd see little William walking those younger ones to the corner store for breakfast, holding their hands and counting out change like he was their daddy instead of that boy who was supposed to be caring for them. The inside of the home, documented extensively by crime scene technicians, told the story of childhood resilience amid adult neglect. The children's rooms were relatively neat, with William's school books stacked carefully by his bed, while the parents' room and common areas were littered with empty alcohol bottles, dirty dishes, and drug paraphernalia poorly hidden in kitchen cabinets. Despite the challenges of their home life, school records indicated that all 3 Barley children showed remarkable adaptability and potential. William had been identified for the gifted program despite his frequent absences, with his 3rd-grade teacher noting he absorbs information like a sponge and shows particular aptitude for science and problem-solving. Daniel's artistic talents had been recognized by his art teacher, who had been saving examples of his colorful drawings to submit to a district-wide art contest, works now preserved as evidence that showed a joyful perspective despite his circumstances. Even little Sophia, though struggling with the adjustment to formal schooling, had shown a natural talent for music in her kindergarten class, her teacher reporting that she could repeat complex rhythms and melodies after hearing them just once, a gift that would never have the chance to develop. The promise in these 3 young lives, extinguished so callously by the people who should have nurtured it, would become a central theme in the prosecutor's case against Jason and Olivia, a devastating accounting of potential deliberately destroyed by parents who viewed their children as inconvenient obstacles to their own youthful freedom. The daily reality for the Barley children was a life of enforced self-sufficiency, punctuated by brief, unpredictable appearances by parents who treated their own home as little more than an occasional crash pad between parties. Surveillance footage from local convenience stores collected during the investigation showed William making regular early morning visits, carefully counting coins to purchase milk and cereal while holding Sophia's hand and keeping Daniel close by his side. Receipts found in William's school backpack revealed purchases of the cheapest available food items: ramen noodles, white bread, peanut butter, basic sustenance bought with coins, and small bills that neighbors suspected were taken from Olivia's purse or earned through small tasks William performed for elderly residents nearby. School counselors had documented concerning statements from the children, including Daniel's casual mention that sometimes we sleep in the car when Mom and Dad have friends over, and Sophia's question to her kindergarten teacher, "Is it nighttime rules that kids have to go to bed, or just when the big people want to have adult time?" The children's isolated existence was compounded by the absence of extended family support, with both Jason and Olivia having long since severed meaningful connections with their families of origin. During the investigation, detectives located Jason's maternal grandparents, an elderly couple living in a nursing home in northern Georgia, who expressed shock at learning they had great-grandchildren, saying they had not spoken to Jason in years after multiple failed attempts to help him overcome his drug problems. Olivia's grandparents, also elderly and living in Florida, told investigators they had sent birthday cards and attempted phone calls for years, but were consistently rebuffed or ignored, with Olivia occasionally contacting them only when in need of money. These distant grandparents, themselves frail and limited in their ability to intervene, represented the only biological family the Barley children had beyond their parents, a sobering reality that had left the siblings entirely dependent on each other and whatever kindness they encountered from teachers and neighbors. In the weeks leading up to their deaths, teachers at Westside Elementary had noted increased concerning behaviors from the children. William appeared especially exhausted and had fallen asleep twice during classes. Daniel had become unusually withdrawn and had stopped sharing his creative stories, and Sophia had begun having toilet accidents despite being previously toilet-trained, a common regression in children experiencing severe stress. The school counselor, Mrs. Diane Patterson, had scheduled a home visit for September 20th, 2023, 2 days after the murders, after multiple attempts to reach Jason and Olivia by phone had failed. In her notes, recovered during the investigation, she had written, "Urgent welfare check needed. Children showing multiple red flags for severe neglect and possible abuse." This planned intervention, coming just days too late to save the children, would become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case, representing a system that had recognized the danger but moved too slowly to prevent tragedy. The funeral for William, Daniel, and Sophia Barley was held 1 week after their deaths, organized and paid for not by their parents, who were by then in custody, but by a coalition of their teachers, school administrators, and community members moved by their story. The small white caskets, arranged side by side in Savannah's oldest cemetery beneath the Spanish moss-draped oaks, were surrounded not by grieving family, but by teachers, school friends, and strangers who had been touched by the children's plight. The kindergarten class sang a song that had been Sophia's favorite. Daniel's art teacher displayed a collection of his colorful drawings, and William's science teacher spoke about a bright mind that had burned briefly but intensely, promising to establish a scholarship in his name. In a poignant detail that underscored the siblings' isolation in life, the guest book from the funeral home contained over 300 signatures, yet not a single one belonged to a blood relative of the children, a stark testimony to the fact that in their short lives, William, Daniel, and Sophia had found family not in those who shared their DNA, but in the community that recognized their worth only after they were gone. The 911 call that brought first responders to the Barley Smith home came in at exactly 1:18 a.m. on September 19, 2023, with Olivia's voice rising to near hysteria as she reported, "Someone broke into our house. Our kids, oh my God, I think our kids are dead." The recording, later played in court, captured Jason in the background, seemingly shouting for the children to wake up, his voice breaking as he called their names repeatedly. Dispatcher Tanisha Brooks maintained a calm professionalism while extracting the address and basic information, noting in her report that she found it unusual that Olivia volunteered. "We just got home from being out. We weren't here when it happened," before being asked about her whereabouts during the incident. Officer Terrence Reynolds and his partner, Officer James Mitchell, arrived at the scene at 1:22 a.m., approaching the house with weapons drawn due to the reported home invasion, where they found Olivia collapsed on the front lawn and Jason pacing frantically on the porch. The initial scene, secured by the first responding officers, presented a troubling mixture of obvious disturbance in the living room, overturned furniture, open drawers, a broken window in the rear of the house, contrasted with the peaceful appearance of the children's bedrooms. Body camera footage from Officer Reynolds documented his first observations. The victims appear undisturbed in their beds, almost as if sleeping, with no signs of struggle or violence in the immediate area. This initial observation would later prove crucial to the investigation, as forensic analysis would determine that the children had not been moved after death, directly contradicting what would be expected in a violent home invasion. Officer Mitchell, checking the perimeter of the home, noted in his report, "No footprints or disturbed vegetation visible outside the broken window despite recent rain, making the ground soft and impressionable," another detail that raised immediate questions about the reported break-in scenario presented by the parents. Detective Andre Wilson, a 15-year veteran of the Savannah Police Department's Homicide Division with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail, arrived at the scene at 1:47 a.m. and immediately instituted protocols designed to both preserve evidence and observe the parents' behavior. With a calm, sympathetic demeanor that belied his growing suspicions, Wilson arranged for Jason and Olivia to be separated under the guise of taking their statements individually to avoid traumatizing each other with the details, a standard technique that allows investigators to identify inconsistencies in stories that haven't been coordinated. Officer Meredith Taylor was assigned to remain with Olivia in a patrol car, while Officer Reynolds stayed with Jason on the front porch, both officers wearing body cameras that would later provide crucial evidence of the parents' behavior when they thought they weren't being closely observed. Taylor's footage captured Olivia checking her reflection in the car window and practicing different crying expressions between periods of apparent grief, while Reynolds' camera recorded Jason repeatedly asking about insurance policies and whether they would need to find a new place to live now. The foundational clue that would ultimately crack the case emerged not from the physical crime scene, but from the digital evidence collected in those first crucial hours. While the parents' phones were initially collected as part of standard procedure to verify their timeline and identify any potential witnesses or leads, Detective Wilson made a critical decision to expedite their analysis rather than focusing solely on the physical evidence of the supposed break-in. This decision, which he would later describe as following his instinct that something about the parents' story didn't add up, led to the discovery of text messages between Jason and Olivia from the weeks and hours before the murders that directly contradicted their claims of being loving parents devastated by a random act of violence. The most damning of these exchanges, recovered by digital forensics expert Tyrone Johnson in the early morning hours of September 19th, included Olivia texting Jason at 6:35 p.m. on the night of the murders. "Did you crush them fine enough? They need to be out completely before we do it." Medical examiner Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the scene at 2:30 a.m. and conducted her preliminary examination of the children's bodies where they lay, noting with scientific precision details that seemed inconsistent with the reported home invasion scenario. The children appeared peaceful, with no defensive wounds or signs of struggle, and rigor mortis had progressed to a degree suggesting they had been deceased for significantly longer than the timeline provided by the parents would indicate. In her initial report, dictated at the scene and later recovered from the investigation files, Dr. Chen stated, "Preliminary examination suggests all three victims were likely deceased between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., with cause of death appearing to be asphyxiation following sedation, given the lack of defensive injuries and the presence of petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, consistent with suffocation." This crucial timeline discrepancy, established within the first hours of the investigation, directly contradicted Jason and Olivia's claim that they had left the children alive and well around 9:30 p.m., providing investigators with their first concrete evidence that the parents' story was fabricated. The processing of the crime scene continued throughout the night and into the following day, with evidence technicians methodically documenting and collecting physical evidence under Detective Wilson's supervision. The staged nature of the break-in became increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. The broken window showed signs of being broken from outside after being unlocked, with glass fragments distributed in a pattern inconsistent with a forced entry. Items reported stolen were later found hidden in the parents' bedroom closet, and shoe prints outside the window matched a pair of Jason's shoes found in his car trunk. Most significantly, toxicology screening performed on blood samples taken from the children at the scene indicated the presence of high levels of a prescription sedative matching pills found in Olivia's purse, with pharmacy records later confirming she had filled a prescription for insomnia just 3 days before the murders. The children's peaceful appearance, combined with the sedative evidence and timeline discrepancies, led Detective Wilson to officially classify the investigation as a homicide with the parents as prime suspects by noon on September 19th, less than 12 hours after the initial 911 call. The digital forensics team, working through the night on the parents' devices, uncovered a disturbing pattern of escalating resentment toward the children in text messages, social media posts, and search histories. In the 3 weeks leading up to the murders, Olivia's search history included queries for how to make death look like accident, undetectable poisons, and can children overdose on sleeping pills, while Jason had researched countries with no extradition to U.S. and how to collect on children's life insurance. Their text exchanges during this period revealed a relationship deeply strained by the responsibilities of parenthood, with frequent complaints about the children ruining their lives and preventing them from enjoying their youth. One particularly chilling exchange from September 10th, just 8 days before the murders, showed Olivia texting Jason, "I can't take another day of this life. 3 kids was never the plan. We're too young for this." Jason's response, "I know, babe. I've been thinking about solutions, permanent ones. We need to talk when kid's asleep." As the digital evidence mounted, Detective Wilson made the decision to continue allowing Jason and Olivia to believe they were being treated as victims rather than suspects, a strategic approach designed to gather maximum information before confronting them with the inconsistencies in their story. The couple was moved to a local hotel under the guise of protecting them from media attention, but in reality, to keep them under surveillance while the investigation proceeded. Separate plainclothes officers were assigned to stay near each parent, ostensibly for support and protection, while actually observing and documenting their behavior and conversations. These officers reported troubling observations. Jason made multiple calls attempting to access the children's school records, where emergency contact information for life insurance beneficiaries was stored. Olivia was overheard telling a friend on the phone that she was finally free and could get back to living now, and neither parent made funeral arrangements or even inquired about claiming their children's bodies from the medical examiner's office. Unusual behavior for grieving parents that added to the investigators' growing certainty about their guilt. The neighborhood canvass, conducted by uniformed officers throughout the day following the murders, yielded additional evidence contradicting the loving parent narrative Jason and Olivia had presented to investigators. Multiple neighbors reported frequent instances of the children being left alone, sometimes overnight, with 8-year-old William clearly serving as caretaker for his younger siblings. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, an elderly neighbor who lived directly across the street, provided a written statement describing how she had offered food to the children on multiple occasions when they appeared hungry, and had once found 5-year-old Sophia wandering alone on the sidewalk at 11 p.m., crying for her brothers. Another neighbor, Mr. Robert Chen, reported frequent loud parties at the house where the kids were clearly trying to sleep while adults were being loud and obnoxious, with obvious drug use going on. Most damning was the statement from Ms. Teresa Washington, who lived next door and told officers she had heard Jason shouting at the children on the evening of September 18th. "If you don't quiet down and go to sleep right now, I swear to God you won't wake up tomorrow." A threat that, in hindsight, carried horrific implications given what would follow. The forensic examination of the children's bodies, conducted by Dr. Chen at the medical examiner's facility on September 19th, provided the final pieces of physical evidence needed to build a case against Jason and Olivia. Toxicology results confirmed high levels of Zolpidem, a prescription sleep medication, in all three children's systems, at dosages far exceeding therapeutic levels for adults and potentially lethal for children of their sizes. Stomach contents revealed the medication had been mixed into their evening meal, likely in the macaroni and cheese found partially digested in their systems. The cause of death for all three children was determined to be asphyxiation by suffocation, with petechial hemorrhages in the eyes and soft tissue damage around the nose and mouth, consistent with pillows being held firmly over their faces while they were in a heavily sedated state. Dr. Chen's official report, completed late on September 19th, concluded, "The manner of death in all three cases is homicide, with evidence suggesting the victims were first heavily sedated and then deliberately suffocated while unconscious, a method that would have required minimal force, but represents a calculated, premeditated act rather than a crime of passion or sudden impulse." By the morning of September 20th, just 36 hours after the initial 911 call, Detective Wilson had compiled sufficient evidence to justify arrest warrants for both Jason Barley and Olivia Smith on 3 counts each of first-degree murder. Rather than executing these warrants immediately, however, Wilson made the tactical decision to bring the parents in for a formal interview under the pretense of helping to identify potential suspects in the ongoing investigation. This approach, designed to catch Jason and Olivia off guard and potentially elicit incriminating statements, was coordinated with District Attorney Rebecca Thompson, who assigned her most experienced prosecutor, Emily Davis, to observe the interviews and provide guidance on building an airtight case. With digital evidence, forensic findings, witness statements, and timeline discrepancies all pointing to the parents' guilt, the investigation had moved with remarkable efficiency from a reported home invasion to a clear case of premeditated filicide, the deliberate murder of one's own children, committed by 2 teenagers who had decided their young family stood in the way of the carefree lifestyle they felt entitled to pursue. The strategic decision to interview Jason and Olivia separately at police headquarters, rather than immediately arresting them, proved crucial in dismantling their carefully constructed facade. Detective Andre Wilson, accompanied by his partner Detective Michelle Lopez, began with Olivia, adopting a compassionate, supportive demeanor that initially put her at ease. The interview room, equipped with hidden cameras capturing every nuanced expression and body language shift, recorded Olivia's confident recounting of the break-in discovery, her voice breaking at precisely the same moments as in previous tellings, a performance consistency that experienced interrogators recognized as rehearsed rather than genuine. Wilson allowed her to complete her narrative, uninterrupted, before gently introducing the first inconsistency. "Olivia, the medical examiner has given us a preliminary time of death for the children that doesn't quite match when you said you left the house. Can you help me understand that?" This simple question, delivered without accusation, produced the first visible crack in Olivia's composure. A momentary widening of her eyes and a pause before she responded with a defensive, "The medical examiner is wrong then. We left them alive. Period." Simultaneously, in another interview room, Jason was being questioned by Detectives Carlos Ramirez and Jennifer Taylor, who employed a slightly more direct approach based on their assessment of his personality type. The transcript of this interview reveals Jason's increasing agitation as questions focused on timeline discrepancies and neighborhood witnesses who reported hearing him threaten the children earlier in the evening. When presented with Mrs. Washington's statement about overhearing him tell the children they wouldn't wake up tomorrow, Jason's demeanor shifted dramatically from grieving father to defensive suspect, his voice rising as he claimed, "That crazy old lady is lying. I never said that." This response notably focused on denying the statement rather than expressing shock or horror that someone would attribute such a threatening statement to him in light of what had happened to his children. a telling psychological indicator that Detective Ramirez immediately flagged in his notes as suspect prioritizing self-protection over children's memory. The parallel interviews continued for over 2 hours before investigators introduced the most damning evidence: the text messages exchanged between Jason and Olivia in the weeks leading up to the murders, and specifically on the day of the killings. Detective Wilson, still maintaining his compassionate facade, slid a printed copy of the text exchanges across the table to Olivia, his voice gentle but firm as he asked, "Can you help me understand what you meant when you texted Jason? Did you crush them fine enough? They need to be out completely before we do it?" The video recording of this moment captured Olivia's transformation, her face freezing momentarily before shifting from grief to calculation, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. After several seconds of silence, she offered the first version of what would become their core defense strategy. "I don't remember sending that. Sometimes when I'm drinking or using, I black out and don't remember things I've done or said." In the adjacent interview room, Jason responded to the same evidence with a strikingly similar claim of memory loss, telling Detective Ramirez, "I have these episodes sometimes where I don't remember stuff, like whole chunks of time just disappear." The near-identical nature of these claims, made simultaneously in separate rooms without the opportunity for coordination, initially struck investigators as potentially significant. However, digital forensics soon revealed both Jason and Olivia had searched online for how to fake amnesia, how to convince people you blacked out, and dissociative disorder symptoms in the days leading up to the murders, searches that strongly suggested their memory loss claims were a pre-planned strategy rather than a genuine psychological phenomenon. This discovery, combined with text messages explicitly discussing their plan to get rid of the kids and be free again, provided investigators with a clear picture of not only what had happened to William, Daniel, and Sophia, but why they had been deliberately killed by parents who viewed them as obstacles to the carefree, party-centered lifestyle they wished to pursue. The turning point in both interviews came when detectives revealed they had recovered deleted text messages from the couple's cloud backups, messages that outlined not just generalized resentment toward parenting, but a specific, evolving plan to murder the children and stage it as a break-in. Most damning was a message sent from Jason to Olivia 2 days before the murders. "Got the pills. Enough to knock out all 3 for good if we wanted, but remember the plan. Make it look like they just went to sleep and never woke up. Nothing violent." Olivia's response: "Perfect. And I'll break the back window from outside after we're done, so it looks like someone broke in while we were out. Friday night, we'll be free." When confronted with these exchanges, both Jason and Olivia rapidly shifted strategy, moving from claims of memory loss to insisting the messages were just venting and dark jokes that they never intended to act upon, despite the clear evidence that they had followed the outline plan almost exactly as described in their texts. The investigation had moved with remarkable speed, transitioning from the initial crime scene response to identifying the parents as prime suspects within 48 hours, largely due to Detective Wilson's instinctive focus on digital evidence rather than being misdirected by the staged break-in. By the afternoon of September 21st, just 3 days after the murders, both Jason Barley and Olivia Smith were formally arrested and charged with 3 counts each of first-degree murder, with additional charges of child endangerment, obstruction of justice, and filing a false police report. The arrest took place at police headquarters following their interviews, with both suspects appearing stunned that their elaborate deception had unraveled so completely and quickly. Body camera footage from Officer Reynolds, who processed Jason's arrest, captured the young father muttering, "This wasn't supposed to happen like this. We had it all planned out. a spontaneous statement that officers immediately documented as it constituted an unintentional admission of guilt that would later prove valuable to prosecutors. The arrest of Jason and Olivia shocked the Savannah community, which had been gripped by the story of 3 innocent children murdered during a home invasion while their young parents were enjoying a rare night out. Local media, which had initially portrayed the couple as tragic victims, now scrambled to reframe their coverage, with headlines shifting dramatically from "Parents' Night Out Ends in Tragedy" to "Police Parents' Planned and Executed Murder of Their 3 Children." The mugshots of Jason and Olivia, broadcast across local and then national news outlets, presented a striking contrast. Jason appeared shell-shocked, his eyes wide and unfocused, while Olivia's expression was unnervingly blank, her eyes direct and challenging as she stared into the camera. These images would become iconic in the case, with behavioral analysts later commenting on Olivia's apparent lack of emotional response as indicative of potential antisocial personality traits that would become a focus during the psychological evaluations that followed. The preliminary hearing, held on September 25th, provided the public with its first comprehensive look at the evidence against Jason and Olivia, as Detective Wilson testified for over 3 hours about the investigation findings. The courtroom fell silent as Wilson methodically outlined the timeline of events, the forensic evidence contradicting the break-in scenario, and most disturbingly, the extensive digital evidence showing weeks of planning and explicit discussions about killing the children to regain their freedom. Judge Gerald Montgomery, visibly disturbed by the evidence presented, denied bail for both defendants, citing the severity of the crimes, the calculated nature of the murders, and the significant flight risk posed by individuals who had researched countries with no extradition to U.S. in the weeks before killing their children. As Jason and Olivia were led from the courtroom in shackles, cameras captured their final interaction before being separated into different detention facilities, a brief exchange of glances that behavioral analysts would later describe as communicative rather than emotional, suggesting they were still strategizing rather than processing the gravity of their actions or showing any remorse for their children's deaths. The investigation continued to build even after the arrests, with Detective Wilson focusing on establishing the full chronology of events leading up to the murders and the extent of premeditation involved. Search warrants executed on the couple's cloud storage accounts and social media profiles revealed months of escalating resentment toward the children, with Olivia frequently complaining in private messages to friends about how having kids so young ruined everything, and Jason telling an online gaming friend that, "These kids are like anchors dragging us down, man. We never get to live." Financial records showed both Jason and Olivia had been unemployed for most of the previous year, subsisting on sporadic gig work and money occasionally provided by Olivia's grandparents, who believed they were helping support the children rather than funding the couple's partying lifestyle. Most disturbing were numerous instances where the couple had spent money on drugs and alcohol, while the children's school records showed they frequently came to school hungry and in unwashed clothing, a pattern of neglect that had triggered multiple reports to Child Protective Services that had not resulted in meaningful intervention. Public response to the case intensified as details emerged about the numerous missed opportunities to protect William, Daniel, and Sophia before their deaths. Child Protective Services faced harsh criticism for failing to adequately investigate multiple reports from teachers, neighbors, and medical professionals documenting clear signs of neglect and potential abuse. Records obtained during the investigation revealed at least 7 separate reports had been filed in the 18 months before the murders, including emergency room visits for unexplained injuries, teachers' observations of chronic hunger and inappropriate clothing for weather conditions, and neighbors' reports of the children being left alone for extended periods. each report had been investigated separately without being connected to establish a pattern, and each had been closed with minimal intervention beyond referrals to parenting classes that Jason and Olivia never attended. This systemic failure to protect 3 vulnerable children became a parallel narrative to the criminal case, sparking calls for reform in Georgia's child welfare system and leading to an independent investigation by the state's Office of the Child Advocate that would eventually result in significant procedural changes and increased funding for intervention services. The psychological evaluation of both defendants, ordered by the court to determine competency to stand trial and explore potential mental health, defenses introduced the concept that would become central to their legal strategy: dissociative amnesia, allegedly triggered by shared trauma. Dr. Marcus Hendricks, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Jason, and Dr. Elizabeth Cohen, who evaluated Olivia, both noted in their reports that the defendants were clinging to their claims of blacking out during the murders, despite overwhelming evidence of planning and clear memory of events before and after the killings. Dr. Cohen's report specifically highlighted Olivia's convenient and selective memory impairment that affects only the most incriminating period while leaving intact memories that might support her innocence, a pattern she described as more consistent with malingering than genuine dissociation. Similarly, Dr. Hendricks noted that Jason showed no clinical signs of dissociation during extensive testing, but demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of how such conditions might present, suggesting research rather than experience. Both doctors concluded the defendants were competent to stand trial, and that their claims of amnesia appeared to be strategic rather than symptomatic of genuine psychological impairment, findings that would significantly undermine the defense they were attempting to build. In the weeks following the arrests, prosecutor Emily Davis worked closely with Detective Wilson to construct a comprehensive case against Jason Barley and Olivia Smith, focusing on 3 key elements: the extensive digital evidence documenting premeditation, the forensic timeline that contradicted the defendants' initial statements, and the psychological motive that drove 2 teenage parents to murder their children. The Savannah Courthouse, with its imposing colonial architecture and oak-lined approach, became the center of intense activity as Davis's team methodically organized thousands of pieces of evidence into a compelling narrative of calculation, deception, and cold-blooded murder motivated by the couple's desire to reclaim their youth and freedom. Working from a dedicated war room in the district attorney's office, where timeline charts, text message transcripts, and forensic reports covered the walls, Davis developed a prosecution strategy that would systematically dismantle the dissociation defense that both defendants continued to cling to despite overwhelming evidence of conscious planning. The digital forensics team, led by Tyrone Johnson, expanded their investigation beyond the obvious text messages to uncover a damning pattern of online research and communication. Johnson's team recovered deleted search histories showing that beginning approximately 6 weeks before the murders, both Jason and Olivia had conducted hundreds of searches related to methods of killing that might appear natural or accidental, with specific focus on sedatives, suffocation techniques, and staging crime scenes. Particularly incriminating was a recovered note in Olivia's phone titled Timeline that outlined a minute-by-minute schedule for September 18th, including entries such as 6 p.m., dinner with crushed meds, 8:30 p.m., check they're out, finish it, and 9:45 p.m., be visible at Moonlight Club. This detailed planning document, created 3 days before the murders and accessed multiple times leading up to the crime, directly contradicted the couple's claims of memory loss and impulsive action, instead revealing a calculated execution of a predetermined plan. The forensic evidence collected from the crime scene and during the autopsies provided the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. Dr. Sarah Chen, the medical examiner, prepared detailed reports documenting how the children had been first heavily sedated with crushed zolpidem tablets mixed into their macaroni and cheese dinner, then suffocated with pillows while unconscious. Toxicology results showed blood concentrations of zolpidem at levels approximately 4 times the therapeutic adult dosage, amounts that would have rendered the children deeply unconscious within 30 to 45 minutes of ingestion. Microscopic examination of lung tissue and petechial hemorrhages in the eyes confirmed death by asphyxiation, with the children's peaceful positioning and lack of defensive injuries consistent with being suffocated while already unconscious from the medication. Most significantly, stomach content analysis and liver metabolite measurements allowed Dr. Chen to establish a scientific timeline, placing the deaths between 7:15 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., hours before Jason and Olivia claimed to have left the home, and directly aligned with the timeline note found on Olivia's phone. Financial investigation revealed another dimension of motive beyond the couple's frequently expressed desire for freedom from parental responsibilities. Detective Wilson, collaborating with forensic accountant Stephanie Goldman, discovered that in the month before the murders, Jason had inquired about increasing the children's life insurance policies from $10,000 each to $50,000 each. Though the application had not been completed due to missed documentation, bank records showed the couple had accumulated over $15,000 in credit card debt, primarily from bar tabs, concert tickets, and clothing purchases, while consistently failing to pay for basic necessities for the children. Most revealing was a text from Olivia to Jason 3 weeks before the murders. "Once they're gone, we can get that insurance money, catch up on bills, and have enough left to leave this place for good. No more being broke, no more being tied down." This financial angle strengthened the prosecution's theory that the murders were not just about eliminating the burden of parenting, but also represented a calculated attempt to profit from the children's deaths. The prosecution team worked diligently to document the history of neglect that had characterized the Barley children's short lives, building a narrative of escalating resentment and mistreatment that culminated in murder. School records subpoenaed from Westside Elementary revealed that William, Daniel, and Sophia had collectively missed over 60 days of school in the previous academic year, with teachers documenting numerous instances of the children arriving hungry, unwashed, and inadequately dressed for the weather. Medical records showed missed vaccinations and appointments, including failure to follow up on concerns raised by pediatricians about potential developmental delays for Sophia. Child Protective Services files, obtained through court order after initial resistance from the agency, documented 7 separate investigations triggered by reports from teachers, medical professionals, and neighbors, all noting concerning conditions, but none resulting in removal of the children or significant intervention, a systemic failure that many in the community now viewed as having contributed to the tragedy. Witness interviews conducted by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Johnson built a compelling picture of the contrast between the couple's public persona and private behavior. Friends of Jason and Olivia described them as fun-loving and always ready to party, with many expressing shock at learning they had 3 children at all, as the couple rarely mentioned them and frequently represented themselves as childless when meeting new people at bars or parties. Babysitters who had occasionally watched the children reported that Jason and Olivia would often return much later than agreed, sometimes not until the following day, and frequently failed to leave adequate food or supplies for the children's care. Most disturbing were statements from neighbors who had repeatedly heard the couple yelling at the children, with Mrs. Washington recalling an incident just 2 weeks before the murders when Olivia had screamed, "I wish you had never been born, you ruined everything," at one of the children loud enough to be heard from next door, a statement that took on horrific new significance in light of what followed. The digital trail of Jason and Olivia's deteriorating attitude toward parenthood extended beyond their private text messages to their social media presence, where they maintained carefully curated images as carefree young adults while rarely acknowledging their children. Prosecutor Davis compiled a timeline of social media posts that told a damning story. While the children were clearly being neglected at home, their parents were posting photos from clubs, concerts, and parties with captions like, "Living my best life," and "Youth is for partying, not responsibility." In the month before the murders, Olivia had posted a selfie with the caption, "Sometimes I think about how different my life would be if certain accidents hadn't happened," widely understood by friends commenting on the post to refer to her unplanned pregnancies. Most chilling was a post Jason made just 5 days before the murders, sharing an article about parents who had lost children in a house fire with his own comment, "Some people get freedom through tragedy. Fate decides who gets a second chance at life." The dissociation defense that both Jason and Olivia continued to develop through their attorneys became the primary target of the prosecution's pretrial strategy. Dr. Marcia Henderson, a nationally recognized expert in forensic psychology specializing in dissociative disorders, was engaged to review all evidence and evaluate the credibility of the defendant's claims. After examining the extensive digital evidence, interview transcripts, and psychological evaluations, Dr. Henderson prepared a comprehensive report concluding, "The level of planning evident in this case, the consistent goal-directed behavior before, during, and after the homicides, and the defendant's demonstrated ability to form new memories during the period they claim to have blacked out, are fundamentally inconsistent with genuine dissociative amnesia." Her report specifically highlighted the recovered searches for "how to fake amnesia" and symptoms of dissociation, as evidence that the defendants were attempting to construct a defense rather than experiencing actual psychological symptoms, noting, "True dissociative states do not typically involve researching how to convince others you're experiencing dissociation." As the prosecution built their case, defense attorneys Robert Blackwell, representing Jason, and Patricia Montgomery, representing Olivia, filed a series of motions challenging the admissibility of evidence and seeking to introduce alternative theories. Their primary strategy focused on portraying the teenagers as victims of mental illness exacerbated by the stress of young parenthood, arguing that they had experienced a shared psychotic disorder that led to a dissociative state during the crimes. This defense strategy faced significant challenges from the start, as the evidence of planning and conscious decision-making before, during, and after the murders directly contradicted claims of dissociation. Judge Harold Thompson, assigned to preside over the trial, rejected most of the defense motions, ruling that the text messages, search histories, and forensic evidence were all admissible, dealing a significant blow to the defense's ability to control the narrative presented to the jury. In his written opinion, denying a motion to exclude the digital evidence, Judge Thompson noted, "The defendant's own words, captured in their text messages and search histories, speak directly to their state of mind and level of planning, making them not just relevant, but central to determining whether these actions were the result of mental illness or calculated decision-making." The final weeks of pretrial preparation saw the prosecution refining their presentation of the foundational clue that had broken the case: the text messages discussing sedating and killing the children, particularly Olivia's, message asking if Jason had crushed them fine enough, and stating, "They need to be out completely before we do it." Forensic linguist Dr. Jennifer Ramsey analyzed the communication patterns between Jason and Olivia, concluding in her report that the consistent, coherent nature of these exchanges demonstrates rational thought processes and goal-directed communication. With no linguistic indicators of dissociation or psychosis that would typically manifest in written communication during altered states of consciousness. This expert analysis further strengthened the prosecution's argument that the dissociation defense was a fabrication designed to evade responsibility rather than a genuine psychological phenomenon, setting the stage for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in Georgia's recent history, a case that had captured national attention for its disturbing portrayal of young parents who had chosen freedom over the lives of their children. The formal arrest of Jason Barley and Olivia Smith took place in separate interrogation rooms at the Savannah Police Department headquarters on September 21, 2023, 3 days after the murders of their children. Detective Andre Wilson, who had maintained a compassionate facade throughout the initial questioning, shifted his approach as he read Jason his Miranda rights, his tone now firm and professional rather than sympathetic. The video recording captured Jason's visible shock at this transition, his expression changing from confident to uncertain as the reality of his situation began to sink in. When Wilson formally stated, "Jason Barley, you are under arrest for the murders of William, Daniel, and Sophia Barley," the young father's facade crumbled momentarily, his voice breaking as he asked, "How did you figure it out so fast? We were careful." This spontaneous question, tantamount to an admission of guilt, was immediately documented and would later become a key piece of evidence at trial, representing a rare, unguarded moment before Jason regained his composure and reverted to his claims of memory loss and dissociation. In the adjacent interrogation room, Olivia's arrest proceeded differently, with Detective Michelle Lopez observing that the young mother showed minimal emotional reaction when informed she was being charged with the murders of her 3 children. The arrest video, later played in court, showed Olivia listening to the Miranda warning with an almost clinical detachment, her expression neutral and her body language relaxed despite the gravity of the charges being read to her. When asked if she understood her rights, Olivia replied with a calm, "Yes, I understand," before immediately stating, "I want to talk to you. I want to explain what really happened." This willingness to continue the interview after being arrested struck Detective Lopez as unusual, particularly given the severity of the charges, and suggested Olivia's confidence in her ability to convince investigators of her dissociation narrative despite the mounting evidence against her. Lopez would later testify that this behavior was consistent with the narcissistic traits Olivia had displayed throughout the investigation, including her apparent belief that she could outsmart the detectives despite the overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The post-arrest interrogation of Jason Barley lasted 4 hours and 27 minutes, during which Detective Wilson employed a strategic approach of gradually revealing evidence to counter each evolving version of Jason's story. The transcript shows Jason initially maintaining complete denial, then shifting to claims of memory loss, before finally attempting to place primary blame on Olivia when confronted with the text message evidence. When Wilson presented the message from Jason stating, "Got the pills, enough to knock out all 3 for good if we wanted," Jason's demeanor changed dramatically, his voice dropping to a whisper as he offered a new narrative. "Look, it was Olivia's idea. She kept saying the kids were ruining our lives, that we were too young to be tied down. I just went along with it because I was afraid she'd leave me." This attempt to minimize his own culpability collapsed when Wilson produced additional messages showing Jason had been equally active in planning the murders, including his detailed instructions on how to suffocate the children without leaving marks and his research on staging a convincing break-in. Olivia's post-arrest interrogation, conducted by Detectives Lopez and Ramirez, revealed a calculated attempt to establish the foundation for a mental health defense. The transcript documents Olivia repeatedly emphasizing that she didn't feel like herself in the weeks leading up to the murders and experienced lost time during the actual killings. When Detective Lopez pointed out the inconsistency between this claim and the detailed planning documented in her text messages, Olivia offered an elaborate explanation. "I've always had these episodes where another part of me takes over. The doctors called it dissociation when I was younger. That other Olivia is the one who planned this, not the real me." This claim prompted Lopez to ask about Olivia's prior mental health treatment, revealing that despite references to previous diagnosis, there were no records of Olivia ever being treated for dissociative disorders or any other serious mental health condition. When confronted with this discrepancy, Olivia became visibly frustrated, stating, "My parents didn't believe in mental health treatment," before falling silent and requesting an attorney, effectively ending the interrogation. The processing of both defendants included standard booking procedures, with officers noting distinct differences in Jason and Olivia's behavior. Booking officer Tanya Rodriguez documented that Jason appeared increasingly agitated during processing, alternating between periods of apparent distress, where he repeatedly asked about potential sentences for capital murder in Georgia, and moments of emotional flatness where he seemed disconnected from the gravity of his situation. In contrast, Officer Rodriguez noted that Olivia maintained an unusually composed demeanor throughout booking, appearing more concerned with her appearance in the mugshot photo than with the charges against her or what would happen next. These behavioral observations would later be included in the prosecution's case file as additional evidence contradicting the defendant's claims of severe psychological disturbance, instead suggesting individuals capable of rational thought who were primarily concerned with self-preservation, rather than expressing any remorse or concern for their deceased children. The preliminary court appearance took place via video link from the Chatham County Detention Center on September 22nd, with Judge Eleanor Simmons presiding over the arraignment. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and community members, many wearing blue ribbons in memory of the Barley children. Jason and Olivia appeared on separate video feeds, both wearing anti-suicide smocks, standard procedure for high-profile murder defendants. The formal reading of charges, 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of child cruelty, 1 count of filing a false police report, and 1 count of obstruction of justice for each defendant, took several minutes, during which court observers noted Jason staring downward, while Olivia maintained direct eye contact with the camera. When Judge Simmons asked for their pleas, both defendants responded not guilty through their court-appointed attorneys, who also immediately filed motions for psychological evaluations to determine competency to stand trial, a standard first step in developing their dissociation defense strategy. The detention hearing held on September 25th provided the first public airing of the evidence against Jason and Olivia, with Detective Wilson testifying for over 3 hours about the investigation findings. The detective methodically outlined how the discovery of text messages planning the murders had transformed a supposed home invasion investigation into a case against the parents, detailing the forensic timeline that proved the children had been killed hours before the couple claimed to have left the house. The most damaging testimony centered on the foundational clue of Olivia's text, asking if Jason had crushed them fine enough and stating, "They need to be out completely before we do it," which Wilson connected directly to the high levels of sedatives found in the children's systems. Judge Gerald Montgomery denied bail for both defendants, citing the severity of the crimes, the calculated nature of the murders, and the significant flight risk posed by individuals who had researched countries with no extradition to U.S. in the weeks before killing their children. The days following the arrests saw a dramatic shift in media coverage and public perception, with initial sympathy for the bereaved parents transforming into horror as details of the planned murders emerged. Local Savannah news outlets, which had initially portrayed Jason and Olivia as tragic victims of a home invasion, now ran headlines like, text messages reveal parents' planned children's deaths, and digital trail leads to parents in triple murder case. National media picked up the story, drawn by the disturbing combination of young parents, premeditated filicide, and the emerging dissociation defense that both legal and psychological experts were already publicly questioning. The case sparked broader discussions about young parenthood, mental health, and the failures of child protective services, with many commentators noting that the Barley children might still be alive if the multiple reports of neglect had been properly investigated and addressed before tragedy struck. Psychological evaluations of both defendants were conducted in early October, with Dr. Marcus Hendricks evaluating Jason and Dr. Elizabeth Cohen evaluating Olivia to determine competency to stand trial and explore the credibility of their dissociation claims. Both reports, filed with the court on October 20th, concluded the defendants were competent to stand trial, understanding the charges against them, and capable of assisting in their own defense. More significantly for the prosecution's case, both evaluations expressed significant skepticism about the defendants' claims of dissociative amnesia during the murders. Dr. Cohen's report specifically noted that Olivia displayed an unusual familiarity with the diagnostic criteria for dissociative disorders and appeared to be strategically presenting symptoms based on textbook descriptions rather than genuine psychological experience. Similarly, Dr. Hendricks documented that Jason's account of his alleged dissociative episodes changed in response to challenges or contradictory evidence, suggesting confabulation rather than honest reporting of experienced symptoms. The development of the case against Jason and Olivia continued through October and November, with prosecutors building a comprehensive timeline of the couple's deteriorating attitude toward parenthood and increasing resentment of their children. Interviews with the children's teachers provided heartbreaking context, revealing William, Daniel, and Sophia as resilient, loving siblings who clearly cared for each other despite their challenging home environment. Third-grade teacher Rebecca Thornton described William as an old soul in a child's body who would save part of his free school lunch to bring home to his younger siblings, while kindergarten teacher Melissa Jordan recalled Sophia asking, "Do all mommies tell their kids they wish they were never born?" A question that had triggered one of the many CPS reports that failed to result in meaningful intervention. These testimonies, combined with the digital evidence of Jason and Olivia's explicit resentment of parenthood, created a powerful narrative of the motive behind the murders. The teenagers had chosen to eliminate what they viewed as obstacles to their desired lifestyle, valuing their freedom to party over the lives of their children. As the prosecution prepared for trial, scheduled to begin in February 2024, the defense strategy centered increasingly on the shared psychotic disorder theory, with attorneys for both Jason and Olivia filing motions to introduce expert testimony on folie à deux, shared psychosis, and dissociative states triggered by the stress of young parenthood. These motions faced strong opposition from prosecutor Emily Davis, who filed comprehensive responses detailing the extensive evidence of rational planning and conscious decision-making that contradicted any claim of psychosis or dissociation. In a key pretrial hearing in December, Judge Harold Thompson, who would preside over the trial, ruled that while the defense could present expert testimony on mental health issues, the prosecution would be permitted to introduce the defendant's internet searches for how to fake amnesia and symptoms of dissociation as evidence relevant to the credibility of their mental health claims. This ruling represented a significant victory for the prosecution, allowing them to directly challenge what Davis characterized as a cynical attempt to exploit mental health diagnoses to escape responsibility for calculated, premeditated murders. The trial of Jason Barley and Olivia Smith began on February 5, 2024, in the Chatham County Courthouse, a stately building in Savannah's historic district where Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees lining the approach to its columned entrance. Security was exceptionally tight, with additional officers posted at all entrances and metal detectors operating at maximum sensitivity due to the intense public interest and emotion surrounding the case. The courthouse steps were crowded with media representatives from across the country, satellite trucks lining the adjacent streets as national networks prepared to cover what had become one of the most closely watched filicide cases in recent memory. Inside the majestic courtroom, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling that had witnessed over a century of Savannah's legal history, court officers carefully seated the overflow crowd, with priority given to teachers and community members who had known the Barley children, their silent presence serving as a reminder of the 3 young lives at the center of the proceedings. Judge Harold Thompson, a 68-year-old jurist known for his strict courtroom management and intolerance for grandstanding, entered precisely at 9:00 a.m., his commanding presence immediately silencing the murmurs that had filled the room. After preliminary instructions to the assembled potential jurors about the serious nature of the case and the importance of setting aside any preconceived notions based on media coverage, the lengthy process of jury selection began. Over the next 3 days, prosecutor Emily Davis and defense attorneys Robert Blackwell, representing Jason, and Patricia Montgomery, representing Olivia, questioned 178 potential jurors, carefully probing their views on mental illness, parental responsibility, and their ability to separate emotional reactions from legal judgment. The process revealed the deep impact the case had already made on the community, with numerous potential jurors dismissed after acknowledging they had already formed firm opinions about the defendant's guilt or couldn't be impartial after seeing the widely published mugshots of Jason and Olivia juxtaposed with school photos of their smiling children. The final jury, seated on February 8th, consisted of 7 women and 5 men, with demographics roughly reflecting Chatham County's diverse population: 5 black jurors, 5 white jurors, and 2 Hispanic jurors, ranging in age from 24 to 71. As court officers led Jason and Olivia into the courtroom for opening statements, observers noted their dramatically different appearances from the disheveled, shocked figures seen in their mugshots. Jason entered wearing a well-fitted navy suit, his hair neatly cut and his expression somber, the very picture of a remorseful young man facing tragedy, while Olivia appeared in a conservative gray dress with minimal makeup and her previously highlighted hair now a subdued natural brown, her flashy manicure replaced by short, unpolished nails. This carefully crafted image transformation, orchestrated by their defense teams to support their portrayal as mentally troubled rather than calculating killers, was immediately noted by media commentators as the first move in what promised to be a highly strategic trial. Prosecutor Emily Davis rose for her opening statement at 10:15 a.m., a commanding presence despite her petite frame, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the jury directly, without notes or podium. This case is not about a tragic accident, a momentary lapse in judgment, or even a crime of passion, she began, establishing the theme that would run throughout the prosecution's case. The evidence will show this was a meticulously planned triple murder, the deliberate killing of 3 innocent children by the 2 people they should have been able to trust above all others, their parents. Davis then methodically outlined the state's case, describing how the investigation had quickly moved from a reported home invasion to the discovery of the parents' extensive digital trail of planning and premeditation. She projected key text messages onto a large screen, including the foundational message from Olivia asking if Jason had crushed them fine enough, and stating, "They need to be out completely before we do it," directly connecting this evidence to the sedatives found in the children's systems. Davis's opening continued for nearly an hour, weaving together the digital evidence, forensic findings, and witness statements into a compelling narrative of two teenage parents who had chosen to eliminate their children rather than accept the responsibilities of parenthood. The evidence will show that Jason Barley and Olivia Smith viewed their children, William, Daniel, and little Sophia, not as the precious lives they were responsible for nurturing and protecting, but as obstacles to the carefree partying lifestyle they felt entitled to pursue. She directly addressed the anticipated defense strategy, stating, "You will hear claims of dissociation and shared psychosis, but you will also see evidence that both defendants researched how to fake these very conditions in the days before the murders, evidence that reveals their claims of mental illness to be as carefully constructed as their staged break-in." Davis concluded by showing school photographs of the three children projected in sequence on the courtroom screen, her voice softening as she told the jury, "William, Daniel, and Sophia deserve the chance to grow up, to pursue their dreams, to experience life beyond the age of 8, 7, and 5. They deserved parents who protected them, not parents who plotted their deaths to regain their freedom. This trial is about justice for three children who can no longer speak for themselves." Defense attorney Robert Blackwell presented opening statements for Jason Barley immediately after the morning break, adopting a tone of somber reflection as he stood before the jury. "This case is a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, a tragedy that has claimed not just 3 young lives but destroyed 5 lives in total," he began, immediately attempting to position Jason as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating killer. Blackwell outlined a narrative of 2 teenagers overwhelmed by responsibilities they were neither emotionally nor psychologically equipped to handle, describing Jason and Olivia as children themselves, who had been thrust into parenthood without adequate support systems or mental health resources. He introduced the central element of Jason's defense, that years of substance abuse combined with the stress of raising 3 children had triggered a dissociative state during which he had participated in actions he would never have committed in his right mind. The science of dissociative disorders is complex, but the evidence will show that Jason Barley experienced a documented psychological phenomenon, a break from reality, during which his conscious mind was not in control of his actions. Blackwell addressed the damning text messages head-on, acknowledging their existence but offering an alternative interpretation. "You will indeed see disturbing messages that appear to show planning, but what you're actually seeing is the documentation of a shared delusion developing between 2 psychologically compromised young people, a phenomenon psychiatrists call folie à deux, or shared psychosis." He emphasized Jason's difficult background, describing a childhood marked by absent parents and early exposure to drugs and alcohol, positioning these factors as contributors to his psychological vulnerability. Most significantly, Blackwell directly challenged the prosecution's portrayal of premeditation, stating, "The evidence will show that in the days and hours after this terrible tragedy, Jason Barley was genuinely shocked and horrified by what had happened, exhibiting the confusion and disorientation consistent with someone emerging from a dissociative episode to discover unimaginable acts had occurred." This framing attempted to recontextualize the behaviors investigators had interpreted as calculation and deception, as instead being symptoms of severe psychological disturbance, setting the stage for the mental health experts the defense planned to call. Patricia Montgomery's opening statement on behalf of Olivia Smith followed a similar strategy, but with key differences tailored to her client's specific circumstances. Montgomery, an experienced defense attorney known for her work on high-profile cases involving female defendants, approached the jury with a quiet intensity, speaking in measured tones that commanded attention without appearing aggressive. "Olivia Smith sits before you today, age 19, charged with crimes so unthinkable that the natural human reaction is to demand explanation, to need someone to blame, she began. That need for explanation is powerful, and the prosecution offers you a simple one, that Olivia was a calculating killer who valued partying over parenting. The reality, as the evidence will show, is far more complex and far more tragic. Montgomery outlined Olivia's history of untreated mental health issues, claiming she had exhibited symptoms of dissociative tendencies from early adolescence that had been exacerbated by 3 pregnancies before age 18 and the overwhelming responsibilities that followed. Montgomery directly addressed the prosecution's strongest evidence, Olivia's text messages planning the children's deaths, by introducing the concept of psychological splitting, describing how trauma and overwhelming stress can cause a fragmentation of consciousness where one part of the mind can plan and execute actions that the core personality would find abhorrent. What you will see in these messages is not the real Olivia Smith, but a dissociated state, a psychological coping mechanism gone horribly wrong, she argued, foreshadowing the testimony of mental health experts who would expand on this theory. Montgomery concluded by asking the jury to approach the evidence with an understanding of the complex psychological factors at play, stating, "This case is not as simple as the prosecution suggests. It requires you to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of consciousness, responsibility, and the human mind under extreme duress. We are not asking you to excuse the inexcusable, but to understand it in its full psychological context." Judge Thompson called a lunch recess following the opening statements, during which legal analysts on the courthouse steps offered their initial assessments of the strategies presented. The consensus among experts interviewed by national media was that while the prosecution had presented a straightforward, evidence-based case focusing on the digital trail of premeditation, the defense teams had effectively signaled their intention to present a unified, shared psychosis theory while maintaining enough separation to avoid conflict between the defendants' individual narratives. Court reconvened at 1:30 p.m., with Prosecutor Davis calling her first witness, Detective Andre Wilson, the lead investigator whose instinctive focus on digital evidence had broken the case open within hours of the initial 911 call, beginning the methodical presentation of evidence that would occupy the next 3 weeks of trial. Detective Wilson's testimony spanned 2 full days, during which he provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation from the initial crime scene response through the arrests of Jason and Olivia. Using courtroom technology to display crime scene photographs, text message exchanges, and timeline charts, Wilson walked the jury through the rapid evolution of the case from reported home invasion to parental filicide. His testimony was particularly powerful when describing the moment the investigation shifted focus, stating, "When I saw the text message asking if the pills had been crushed fine enough and saying the children needed to be out completely before we do it, I knew immediately we weren't dealing with a break-in gone wrong. We were looking at a premeditated plan to murder 3 children." This testimony directly connected the foundational clue, the explicit text messages planning the murders, to the physical evidence of sedatives in the children's systems and the cause of death determined by the medical examiner. Cross-examination by defense attorneys focused on attempting to establish timeline gaps that could support the dissociation narrative, with Blackwell pressing Detective Wilson on whether there were periods during the evening of the murders when the defendant's activities and communications were not fully documented. Wilson largely deflected these attempts, referring repeatedly to the detailed timeline note recovered from Olivia's phone that accounted for the couple's actions and intentions at specific intervals throughout the evening. Montgomery took a different approach in her cross-examination, focusing on Olivia's behavior during questioning and whether it might be consistent with psychological disturbance rather than calculated deception. Wilson maintained his position that both defendants had displayed behavior consistent with people attempting to evade responsibility rather than individuals experiencing genuine psychological disturbance, noting that their claims of memory loss emerged only after being confronted with incriminating evidence they couldn't otherwise explain. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from digital forensics expert Tyrone Johnson, who provided detailed analysis of the defendants' phones, computers, and cloud accounts, revealing months of escalating resentment toward the children and weeks of specific planning for their murders. Johnson's testimony was particularly damaging to the defense's dissociation narrative, as he presented evidence of the defendant's searches for how to fake amnesia, symptoms of dissociation, and how to convince people you blacked out, all conducted in the days immediately preceding the murders. Johnson also highlighted a note in Jason's phone titled "Story for Police" that contained bullet points aligning almost exactly with the narrative both defendants had initially presented about discovering their children after returning from their night out, further undermining their claims that their consistent initial statements had been coincidental rather than coordinated. Medical examiner Dr. Sarah Chen provided clinical yet powerful testimony about the children's causes of death using medical terminology that couldn't disguise the horror of what had happened. Dr. Chen explained how toxicology results showed all three children had been heavily sedated with Zolpidem, a prescription sleep medication, before being suffocated with pillows while unconscious. She established a scientific timeline placing the deaths between 7:15 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. based on stomach contents and liver metabolite analysis, directly contradicting the defendant's claim of leaving the children alive at 9:30 p.m. Most disturbingly, Dr. Chen testified that the sedative doses, while high, would not have been immediately fatal on their own, meaning the children had been deliberately suffocated rather than simply overdosed, a distinction that spoke directly to the intentional nature of the killings and undermined any suggestion that the deaths might have been accidental. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had established a solid foundation of physical and digital evidence pointing to premeditated murder, effectively setting the stage for the more emotional testimony to follow. Judge Thompson adjourned court on Friday afternoon with instructions to the jury to avoid media coverage and discussion of the case, a challenging directive given the national attention the trial had attracted. Outside the courthouse, community members maintained a growing memorial to William, Daniel, and Sophia with stuffed animals, children's books, and school photos surrounded by candles that were kept continually lit, a visual reminder of the three young lives at the center of the legal proceedings unfolding within the historic building's walls. The trial had only just begun, but already the evidence presented had painted a disturbing picture of calculation and premeditation that the defense's psychological explanations would struggle to overcome in the minds of 12 citizens tasked with delivering justice for three children who had deserved protection, but received only betrayal from those they should have been able to trust above all others. The second week of trial began with testimony from Dr. Marcia Henderson, a nationally recognized expert in forensic psychology specializing in dissociative disorders, whose analysis directly challenged the core of the defense strategy. Taking the stand on Monday morning, Dr. Henderson presented as the consummate professional expert witness, poised, articulate, and impressively credentialed, with over 20 years of experience evaluating dissociative disorders in forensic contexts. Prosecutor Emily Davis established Dr. Henderson's qualifications through a series of questions about her education, research, and extensive experience testifying in cases involving claims of dissociative amnesia, laying a foundation of expertise that would be difficult for the defense to undermine. Once qualified as an expert witness by the court, Dr. Henderson explained the nature of genuine dissociative disorders to the jury in accessible language, describing the specific clinical criteria that distinguish actual dissociation from fabricated claims and the scientifically validated methods of assessment used to differentiate between them. Dr. Henderson's most powerful testimony came when Davis asked her to evaluate the defendant's claims based on the evidence she had reviewed, which included their psychological evaluations, interview transcripts, digital communications, and behavior before, during, and after the murders. In my professional opinion, based on a comprehensive review of all available evidence, the defendant's claims of dissociative amnesia during the murders are not consistent with genuine dissociative phenomena, she stated firmly. Dr. Henderson proceeded to outline 6 specific factors that contradicted authentic dissociation. First, the extensive digital evidence shows clear, goal-directed planning over an extended period, including detailed discussions of methods and cover-up strategies. Second, both defendants demonstrated the ability to form new memories during the period they claimed to have blacked out, as evidenced by their text exchanges during the murders themselves. Third, their behavior immediately following the deaths, including the carefully staged break-in and establishment of alibis, shows sequential, rational decision-making inconsistent with dissociative states. Dr. Henderson continued her methodical dismantling of the dissociation defense, noting, fourth, the defendant searches for how to fake amnesia and symptoms of dissociation in the days before the murders strongly suggest preparation of a defense strategy rather than genuine psychological phenomena. Fifth, their initial detailed and consistent accounts to police, which only changed to claims of memory loss after being confronted with incriminating evidence, follow a pattern we often see in malingering rather than actual dissociation. And sixth, both defendants demonstrated selective amnesia that conveniently affected only incriminating periods while leaving intact memories that might support their innocence, a pattern inconsistent with how genuine dissociative amnesia typically manifests. This comprehensive expert analysis struck at the heart of the defense strategy, providing jurors with a scientific framework for interpreting the defendant's claims of memory loss as strategic rather than symptomatic. Cross-examination by defense attorneys attempted to challenge Dr. Henderson's conclusions, with Robert Blackwell questioning whether traumatic childhoods and substance abuse could create conditions for dissociative episodes even without prior diagnosis. Henderson acknowledged that trauma and substance use can contribute to dissociative symptoms, but maintained that the pattern of behavior in this case simply doesn't align with how dissociation actually manifests, regardless of its origins. Patricia Montgomery's cross-examination focused on attempting to establish the possibility of shared psychosis, or folie à deux, between Jason and Olivia, suggesting their mutual reinforcement of destructive ideas could have created a disconnected mental state. Henderson responded with clinical precision. While shared delusional disorder is a recognized phenomenon, it typically involves false beliefs, not memory gaps, and importantly, doesn't eliminate awareness of one's actions or ability to form memories during those actions. The evidence in this case shows awareness, planning, and memory formation throughout the period in question. Following Dr. Henderson's testimony, the prosecution called a series of witnesses who had directly interacted with the Barley children, painting a heartbreaking picture of 3 resilient young lives in stark contrast to the defendant's portrayal of burdensome obstacles to their freedom. Rebecca Thornton, William's 3rd-grade teacher, testified with barely contained emotion about the 8-year-old's intelligence and protective nature toward his siblings, describing how he would save portions of his free school lunch to bring home to Daniel and Sophia. William was a child taking on adult responsibilities, Thornton testified, her voice breaking slightly. He once explained that he was late to school because he had to make breakfast for his younger siblings, saying, Sometimes I have to make breakfast for Daniel and Sophia, and it takes a long time because I'm not tall enough to reach the stove. Good. That statement led me to file a report with Child Protective Services, one of several that sadly didn't result in meaningful intervention before it was too late. Daniel's second-grade teacher, Michael Rivera, described the 7-year-old as perpetually optimistic despite obvious challenges at home, sharing examples of the boy's creative storytelling and imaginative play that often featured heroic older brothers saving their families from danger, a poignant reflection of his relationship with William. Rivera testified about Daniel's academic potential, noting, "Despite frequent absences and often coming to school exhausted, Daniel showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and science, grasping concepts quickly and helping other students understand them." He also described concerning incidents that had prompted his own CPS reports, including Daniel arriving at school in the same clothes for multiple days, appearing unfed, and once mentioning casually that sometimes we sleep in the car when Mom and Dad have friends over, a statement that suggested the children were displaced from their beds when the defendants hosted parties. Perhaps the most emotionally impactful testimony came from Melissa Jordan, Sophia's kindergarten teacher, who spoke about the 5-year-old's first and only month of school before her death. Jordan described Sophia as a tiny old soul who watched everything with intelligent, wary eyes and showed remarkable musical talent, despite her limited exposure to educational opportunities. Sophia could repeat complex rhythms and melodies after hearing them just once, a natural gift that delighted our music teacher, Jordan testified. Most disturbingly, she recounted a conversation with Sophia that had immediately triggered a CPS report. "Sophia asked me very seriously, 'Do all mommies tell their kids they wish they were never born?' When I asked her why she was asking that question, she simply said, 'My mommy tells me that when she's angry, which is a lot.'" This testimony directly connected to text and social media evidence the prosecution had already presented, showing Olivia's explicit resentment of motherhood and frequent statements that her children had ruined her life. The prosecution strategically followed this emotional testimony with clinical evidence from Dr. Jennifer Ramsey, a forensic linguist who had analyzed the defendant's text messages, social media posts, and search histories. Dr. Ramsey provided expert analysis of the communication patterns between Jason and Olivia, explaining to the jury how the consistent, coherent nature of their exchanges demonstrated rational thought processes and goal-directed communication throughout the period they later claimed to have experienced dissociative states. The linguistic evidence shows no indicators of disrupted thought processes, confusion, or dissociation in either defendant's written communication before, during, or after the murders, Dr. Ramsey testified. Instead, we see clear sequential planning, problem-solving, and coordination, all cognitive functions that are typically impaired during genuine dissociative episodes. Dr. Ramsey's testimony was particularly effective in countering the defense's claims when she analyzed the evolution of Jason and Olivia's communication about their children over the months leading up to the murders. Using a series of charts projected for the jury, she demonstrated how references to the children shifted from occasional complaints typical of parents, "The kids are driving me crazy today," to increasingly dehumanizing language, "Those anchors dragging us down," and finally to explicit discussions of elimination. "Once they're gone, we'll be free." This linguistic progression shows a calculated psychological distancing, Dr. Ramsey explained, a deliberate recategorization of the children from family members to obstacles, which is consistent with the cognitive preparation many perpetrators engage in before violence. Essentially, a linguistic trail of premeditation that directly contradicts claims of sudden dissociation or psychosis. The defense began presenting its case on Wednesday of the second week, calling Dr. Leonard Goldstein, a psychiatrist specializing in adolescent mental health, as their first expert witness. Dr. Goldstein testified about the psychological development of teenagers, emphasizing that the human brain continues developing well into the 20s, with the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences, being among the last regions to fully mature. Jason and Olivia, at just 19 years old, were still neurologically adolescents, Dr. Goldstein explained. Yet they were facing the enormous stresses of raising 3 young children without adequate support systems, financial resources, or parenting skills. This testimony attempted to frame the defendant's actions within a context of neurological immaturity rather than calculated malice, suggesting their youth made them particularly vulnerable to psychological breakdown under the pressures of parenthood. Dr. Goldstein went on to introduce the concept of dissociative coping mechanisms as responses to overwhelming stress, describing how young people with histories of trauma or substance abuse might experience psychological detachment when faced with circumstances that exceed their coping capabilities. While acknowledging he had not personally evaluated either defendant, Dr. Goldstein testified that based on his review of their histories and the case materials, their reported symptoms were potentially consistent with stress-induced dissociative episodes exacerbated by substance use. This carefully qualified opinion offered support for the defense's central narrative, while avoiding direct contradiction of Dr. Henderson's more definitive conclusions based on her comprehensive evaluation, a strategic approach that preserved some credibility with the jury while still advancing the defense's psychological explanation for the murders. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Davis effectively challenged Dr. Goldstein's testimony by focusing on the specific evidence of planning and conscious decision-making in this case. Doctor, would you agree that researching methods to kill children, discussing those methods over text messages for weeks, purchasing sedatives specifically for this purpose, creating a written timeline for the murders, and then carefully staging a break-in afterward all require sequential, rational thought processes, she asked. Dr. Goldstein conceded that such actions would typically involve executive functioning capabilities inconsistent with complete dissociation, though he attempted to maintain that compartmentalized thinking could potentially allow for planning within a dissociative framework, a qualification that Davis quickly challenged by referring back to Dr. Henderson's expert testimony on the clinical criteria for genuine dissociative disorders, which had explicitly ruled out such scenarios as clinically valid. The defense continued with testimony from Dr. Victoria Sanchez, a psychologist who had conducted a retrospective psychological evaluation of Olivia Smith, focusing specifically on her history and mental state. Dr. Sanchez described Olivia as someone who had experienced significant developmental trauma, including emotional neglect, early substance exposure, and the stress of 3 pregnancies during adolescence. These experiences created a perfect storm of psychological vulnerability, Dr. Sanchez testified, setting the stage for potential dissociative responses when faced with overwhelming stress. She introduced the concept of maternal identity conflict as a factor in Olivia's psychology, suggesting that becoming a mother at 15 had created an irreconcilable conflict between Olivia's developmental needs as an adolescent and the demands of parenting 3 young children. Dr. Sanchez's testimony attempted to contextualize Olivia's searches for information on dissociative symptoms not as preparation for a defense, but as digital help-seeking behavior from someone recognizing disturbing psychological experiences. It's not uncommon for individuals experiencing psychological symptoms to research those symptoms online, Dr. Sanchez explained, particularly when formal mental health care is inaccessible or stigmatized. This interpretation directly contradicted the prosecution's characterization of these searches as evidence of planning a fake mental health defense, offering the jury an alternative explanation that Prosecutor Davis immediately attacked on cross-examination by pointing out that these searches occurred in the same time period as searches for how to make death look like accident and countries with no extradition to U.S. Contextual evidence that severely undermined the help-seeking characterization. Similar psychological testimony was offered for Jason Barley by Dr. Robert Phillips, who described the young father as suffering from untreated trauma responses and substance-induced cognitive impairment that created conditions for potential dissociative episodes. Dr. Phillips introduced the concept of coercive control in the relationship between Jason and Olivia, suggesting Jason's actions may have been influenced by psychological manipulation from a dominant partner, a theory that created subtle tension between the defense teams by potentially shifting greater culpability to Olivia. On cross-examination, Davis highlighted the contradictions in this portrayal by presenting text messages initiated by Jason that showed him actively planning aspects of the murders and sometimes pushing a hesitant Olivia forward, effectively dismantling the suggestion that he was merely following a dominant partner's lead rather than being an equal participant in the planning and execution of the crimes. The defense case took a risky turn when Jason Barley elected to testify on his own behalf, against the visible concern of his attorney Robert Blackwell. Taking the stand on Friday morning, Jason presented a dramatically different appearance from the confident young man seen in pre-arrest photographs, now appearing thin and subdued in his Navy suit, his voice quiet and occasionally trembling as he answered preliminary questions about his background and relationship with Olivia. Jason described a childhood marked by parental absence and early exposure to drugs and alcohol, painting a picture of a young man who had never had proper adult guidance or models of responsible behavior. When questioned about becoming a father at 16, he described feeling completely overwhelmed and like my life was over before it had even started. Sentiments that Blackwell connected to Jason's increasing substance use as a coping mechanism for the stress of teenage parenthood. The central portion of Jason's testimony focused on his claims of experiencing lost time and memory gaps in the months leading up to the murders, which he described as like watching someone else use my body sometimes, especially when I was using. He claimed to have no clear memory of the night of September 18th, testifying, "I remember giving the kids dinner, and then things get blurry after that. The next clear memory I have is being at the club with Olivia, taking selfies and feeling, I don't know, free, then coming home and finding them like that." This testimony directly contradicted the extensive evidence of planning and conscious action during the supposedly blurry period, a discrepancy that Prosecutor Davis was visibly eager to address as she prepared her notes for cross-examination. Davis's cross-examination of Jason was methodical and devastating, systematically walking him through the digital evidence that directly contradicted his claims of memory loss. "Mr. Barley, you claim you don't remember what happened after giving the children dinner, yet your phone shows you sent 6 text messages between 7:15 p.m. and 8:45 p.m. that night, including one at 8:32 p.m. stating, 'It's done. All 3 are handled. Start getting ready to go out,'" Davis stated, projecting the message on the courtroom screen. "Do you expect this jury to believe you sent that message during a dissociative state that you have no memory of?" Jason's response, "I must have sent it without really being aware of what I was doing," drew audible reactions from jurors, with several visibly shaking their heads at the implausibility of this explanation. Davis continued this approach for nearly 3 hours, confronting Jason with each piece of evidence showing conscious, sequential actions before, during, and after the murders, effectively undermining any remaining credibility in his dissociation claims. The most dramatic moment of Jason's cross-examination came when Davis projected his search history from September 15th, 3 days before the murders, showing sequential searches for how to suffocate someone without leaving marks, can kids overdose on sleeping pills, and how to fake amnesia if caught. Davis asked directly, "Mr. Barley, are you asking this jury to believe that you researched how to fake amnesia 3 days before allegedly experiencing amnesia during the murders of your children? That's quite a coincidence, isn't it?" Jason's visible discomfort and stumbling response, I can't explain that. Maybe I was researching it for something else," created a pivotal moment in the trial, with courtroom observers noting several jurors exchanging glances that suggested the defense's narrative had lost all credibility in their eyes. By the time Jason left the stand, legal analysts commenting outside the courthouse were in agreement that his testimony had likely done significant damage to his own case. Olivia Smith chose not to testify in her own defense, a decision that her attorney Patricia Montgomery framed as based on her fragile psychological state rather than strategic considerations. The defense concluded its case with testimony from Dr. Elizabeth Cohen, one of the forensic psychiatrists who had conducted the initial competency evaluations, who had been recalled to provide additional context for her findings. While maintaining that Olivia was competent to stand trial, Dr. Cohen testified that during her evaluation she had observed clinically significant indicators of psychological disturbance and patterns of thought consistent with someone who has experienced dissociative episodes. On cross-examination, however, Davis effectively highlighted portions of Dr. Cohen's original report that had expressed skepticism about Olivia's selective memory impairment and noted her sophisticated knowledge of how dissociative conditions might present, suggesting research rather than experience, conclusions that directly undermined the testimony she had just offered and left jurors with a clear impression of a defense expert, contradicting her own prior professional assessment. As the evidence phase of the trial drew to a close, the prosecution called one final rebuttal witness, Diane Patterson, the school counselor who had scheduled a home visit for September 20th, 2023, 2 days after the murders, after multiple attempts to reach Jason and Olivia by phone, had failed. Patterson's testimony provided a devastating conclusion to the evidence as she shared the notes from her planned intervention, which stated, "Urgent welfare check needed. Children showing multiple red flags for severe neglect and possible abuse." Through tears, Patterson testified, "I had finally gathered enough documentation from teachers, attendance records, and the children's own statements to justify immediate intervention. If they had just lived 2 more days, we might have been able to remove them from that home and give them a chance at life." This powerful testimony underscored the tragic timing of the murders, suggesting that Jason and Olivia may have accelerated their plans precisely because they sensed the system was finally closing in on their neglect and abuse, an interpretation that directly connected to their motive of eliminating the children to preserve their freedom and avoid the consequences of their parental failures. After 4 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began on March 4, 2024, with prosecutor Emily Davis rising to address the jury one final time, her manner both confident and somber as she approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, this case has asked you to consider 2 fundamentally different narratives about what happened to William, Daniel, and Sophia Barley, she began, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. The first narrative, supported by overwhelming evidence, is that Jason Barley and Olivia Smith deliberately planned and executed the murders of their 3 children because they saw them as obstacles to the carefree lifestyle they wanted to pursue. The second narrative, offered by the defense despite contradicting their own digital footprint, is that they experienced convenient memory loss during the exact period when they sedated and suffocated their children while maintaining perfect memory of everything before and after these acts. Davis paused, making eye contact with several jurors before continuing. The evidence has made clear which narrative reflects reality and which was constructed after the fact to evade responsibility. Davis methodically reviewed the key evidence presented over the previous weeks, beginning with the foundational clue that had broken the case. The text messages explicitly planning the murders, particularly Olivia's message, asking if Jason had crushed them fine enough and stating they need to be out completely before we do it. She connected this digital evidence directly to the forensic findings, reminding jurors that all three children had indeed been found with high levels of sedatives in their systems before being suffocated, exactly as outlined in the defendant's messages. These weren't the ramblings of people in dissociative states, Davis argued. They were step-by-step instructions being shared between conscious, deliberate killers. She projected a timeline showing how the defendant's searches, messages, and actions formed a coherent narrative of planning and execution over several weeks, culminating in murders carried out precisely as discussed and a staged break-in that followed their predetermined script. Addressing the defense's mental health arguments directly, Davis reminded the jury of Dr. Henderson's expert testimony dismantling the dissociation claims, highlighting particularly the searches for how to fake amnesia and symptoms of dissociation in the days before the murders. These searches reveal the calculated nature of not just the murders, but of the very defense strategy you've heard in this courtroom, Davis stated firmly. They researched how to fake memory loss before allegedly experiencing memory loss, a coincidence that defies belief. She contrasted these searches with others made in the same time period: how to make death look like accident, countries with no extradition to U.S., and can children overdose on sleeping pills, creating a comprehensive picture of premeditation that directly contradicted any suggestion of impulsive action or dissociative states. Davis concluded her closing argument by returning to the victims, projecting school photographs of William, Daniel, and Sophia on the courtroom screen as she spoke about the lives they should have had the chance to live. William was only 8 years old, but already showing remarkable intelligence and a protective nature toward his siblings. Daniel, at 7, was creative and optimistic despite his challenges. And little Sophia, just 5, had a natural musical talent that her teachers recognized even in her short month of kindergarten. Davis's voice softened with emotion, but remained steady as she continued. These children deserved parents who would nurture their potential and protect them from harm. Instead, they got Jason Barley and Olivia Smith, two people who valued their freedom to party over the lives of their own children, who saw these precious lives as nothing more than anchors dragging them down, and who made a deliberate choice to eliminate them rather than accept the responsibilities of parenthood. Her final words to the jury were simple but powerful. William, Daniel, and Sophia can no longer speak for themselves. Today, you have the opportunity to speak for them through your verdict. They deserve justice. They deserve the truth to be acknowledged. They deserve better than the lies their killers continue to tell. Defense attorney Robert Blackwell presented closing arguments for Jason Barley next, adopting a tone that acknowledged the emotional weight of the case while still attempting to create reasonable doubt about his client's mental state during the murders. No one in this courtroom disputes that these children died terrible deaths or that their parents were involved in those deaths, Blackwell began, a strategic concession that surprised some observers. What this case is truly about is state of mind, whether Jason Barley acted with the deliberate, premeditated intent required for first-degree murder, or whether he was experiencing a psychological break that prevented him from fully understanding or controlling his actions. Blackwell argued that Jason's history of substance abuse, traumatic childhood, and the overwhelming stress of teenage parenthood had created conditions for genuine psychological disturbance, suggesting that what appeared as planning might have been behavior driven by psychological forces beyond his conscious control. Blackwell addressed the damning searches for information on faking amnesia by offering an alternative explanation. The prosecution wants you to see these searches as evidence of planning a defense, but consider another possibility, that Jason was experiencing genuine memory gaps and confusion in the weeks before these tragic events and was trying to understand what was happening to him. This interpretation strained credibility given the totality of evidence, a weakness apparent in the skeptical expressions visible on several jurors' faces. Blackwell concluded by asking the jury to consider a verdict on lesser charges, arguing that even if they rejected complete dissociation, the evidence supported a young man in severe psychological distress rather than a calculated killer, a framing designed to open the door to potential consideration of second-degree murder or manslaughter rather than the first-degree murder charges that carried potential life sentences. Patricia Montgomery's closing argument for Olivia Smith took a slightly different approach, leaning more heavily into the mental health defense while attempting to shift greater blame to Jason. Olivia Smith was a 15-year-old child when she had her first baby, a 17-year-old with 2 children, and a teenage mother of 3 by 18, Montgomery began, emphasizing her client's youth and the overwhelming responsibilities she faced. The psychological evidence has shown how these circumstances, combined with her traumatic background and lack of support systems, created the perfect storm for psychological fragmentation, a splitting of consciousness that allowed one part of her mind to participate in terrible acts that her core self would never have conceived. Montgomery suggested that Jason had been the primary driver of the murder plan, with Olivia in a psychologically vulnerable state that made her susceptible to his influence, a characterization that visibly displeased Jason and created subtle tension between the co-defendants for the first time in the trial. Montgomery confronted the text message evidence directly, arguing that these messages show a person in a dissociated state, using language and expressing thoughts disconnected from her true self. This interpretation faced an uphill battle given the coherent, sequential nature of the messages and their clear connection to actions taken during the murders. Montgomery concluded by asking the jury to consider Olivia's youth and psychological vulnerability, arguing that a 19-year-old girl overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond her capacity deserves to be understood in the full context of her mental state, not simply condemned based on actions taken when her mind had fractured under unbearable pressure. This appeal for understanding rather than pure punishment seemed to resonate with at least a few jurors, though most maintained neutral expressions that revealed little about their internal assessments of this argument. Prosecutor Davis delivered a powerful rebuttal, directly addressing the defense's attempts to reframe the evidence of planning as symptoms of psychological disturbance. The defense wants you to believe that researching murder methods, creating detailed timelines, and executing those plans step by step are somehow evidence of mental breakdown rather than calculation, she stated incredulously. They're asking you to ignore the obvious interpretation of this evidence in favor of a theory that conveniently excuses their clients from full responsibility. Davis reminded jurors that both defendants had been evaluated by multiple mental health professionals who found no evidence of genuine dissociative disorders and that their claims of memory loss had emerged only after being confronted with evidence they couldn't otherwise explain. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, Davis concluded. Jason Barley and Olivia Smith weren't experiencing psychological breaks that just happened to manifest as perfectly executed murder plans. They were two teenagers who decided their children were in the way of the life they wanted, and they took deliberate steps to eliminate that obstacle. It's as straightforward and as horrifying as that. Judge Harold Thompson delivered his instructions to the jury on Thursday afternoon, March 7th, carefully explaining the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, as well as the requirements for finding premeditation and the legal standards for mental state defenses. He instructed jurors that they must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt of the defendant's guilt to convict on any charge, and that they should consider each defendant and each count separately in their deliberations. The jury of 7 women and 5 men began their deliberations at 3:45 p.m. on Thursday, working until 6:30 p.m. before being sequestered in a local hotel for the night. They resumed deliberations at 9:00 a.m. on Friday, March 8th, sending out only one question to the judge around 11:30 a.m. requesting clarification on the legal definition of premeditation, particularly as it related to the time frame required for deliberation to qualify as premeditated under Georgia law. At 2:17 p.m. on Friday, March 8th, after approximately 8 hours of deliberation spread over 2 days, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as news spread, with media representatives, legal observers, and community members taking their seats for what promised to be an emotional conclusion to the case that had captivated Savannah and the nation for months. The Barley children's teachers sat together in the front row behind the prosecution table, many wearing blue ribbons in memory of William, Daniel, and Sophia. Court officers led Jason and Olivia into the courtroom, both appearing tense but composed as they took their seats between their attorneys, avoiding eye contact with each other as they had throughout most of the trial. Judge Thompson called the court to order at exactly 3:00 p.m., the hushed anticipation in the room almost palpable as he instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury. As the jury filed in, observers noted their solemn expressions, several members appearing emotionally drained by the weight of their responsibility. The foreman, a 57-year-old high school principal, handed the verdict forms to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Thompson. After reviewing the forms to ensure they were properly completed, Thompson returned them to the bailiff, who handed them back to the foreman with instructions to read the verdicts aloud. The foreman rose, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. In the case of State of Georgia versus Jason Barley, on the count of murder in the first degree of William Barley, we find the defendant guilty. A muffled sob came from the teachers' section as the foreman continued. On the count of murder in the first degree of Daniel Barley, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Sophia Barley, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman then proceeded to the verdicts for Olivia Smith, maintaining the same steady pace. In the case of State of Georgia versus Olivia Smith, on the count of murder in the first degree of William Barley, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Daniel Barley, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Sophia Barley, we find the defendant guilty. Additional guilty verdicts were read for the lesser charges of child cruelty, filing a false police report, and obstruction of justice for both defendants, completing a clean sweep for the prosecution on all counts. As the final verdict was read, Jason's composure broke slightly, his shoulders slumping as he stared downward at the defense table. Olivia's reaction, captured by courtroom cameras and soon to become one of the most discussed aspects of the case, was strikingly different. Her expression shifted from neutral to what appeared to be a slight smile, quickly suppressed, but noticed by many in the courtroom, including Judge Thompson, whose eyes narrowed as he observed her reaction. Judge Thompson thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would take place the following Monday, March 11th, after which he ordered the defendants returned to custody. As court officers approached to escort Jason and Olivia back to the detention facility, Olivia leaned toward her attorney and whispered something that made Patricia Montgomery visibly uncomfortable, creating a moment of tension that reporters in the courtroom immediately noted. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Emily Davis delivered brief remarks to the assembled media, stating, "Today, justice was served for 3 children who deserved so much better than what they received from the 2 people who should have protected them above all others. While no verdict can bring William, Daniel, and Sophia back, today's decision ensures that those responsible for their deaths will face the consequences of their actions." Davis declined to comment on potential sentencing recommendations, stating only that the prosecution will be seeking appropriate punishment that reflects the calculated nature of these crimes and the 3 young lives that were deliberately taken. The sentencing hearing began at 10 a.m. on Monday, March 11th, with the courtroom even more crowded than it had been for the verdict. Judge Thompson opened the proceedings by explaining that he would hear impact statements and sentencing recommendations before making his decision. The prosecution presented impact statements from the children's teachers and school counselor Diane Patterson, who spoke movingly about the potential lost when William, Daniel, and Sophia's lives were cut short. In a particularly poignant moment, Rebecca Thornton, William's teacher, addressed the defendants directly. "William once told me he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up so he could help people who are hurting. He was already thinking about helping others at 8 years old, while you were only thinking about yourselves. He deserved the chance to grow up and fulfill that dream, but you took that from him because he was inconvenient to your partying schedule. There is no punishment sufficient for that level of selfishness." When the court turned to victim impact statements from family members, there was a painful silence. No relatives had come forward to speak for the children, highlighting the isolation that had characterized their short lives. In lieu of family statements, Prosecutor Davis read from William's notebook found during the investigation, in which he had kept a careful record of the times his parents left them alone, with entries like, "Mom and Dad gone again. I will protect D and S until they come back." Davis's voice broke slightly as she concluded, "These children had no one to speak for them in life except each other." William, at 8 years old, took on the responsibility that his parents abandoned. Today we ask the court to speak for them in the only way left available, through a sentence that reflects the magnitude of this betrayal and ensures these defendants can never harm another child. When invited to make statements before sentencing, Jason Barley rose with visible reluctance, his voice barely audible as he read from a prepared statement. "I know nothing I say can bring back my children or make anyone understand what happened. I love them, and I will live with this pain for the rest of my life. I'm sorry." The brevity and vagueness of his statement, which notably lacked any direct acknowledgement of responsibility for the murders, drew audible reactions from spectators in the courtroom, with several of the children's teachers shaking their heads in disbelief at what many perceived as a continued attempt to evade full accountability even after conviction. Olivia Smith's statement was even more controversial, as she adopted a tone that many observers described as detached and self-pitying rather than remorseful. "I was a child myself when I started having children. Nobody helped me. Nobody understood how hard it was. I loved my kids in my own way, but I was broken inside. I need help, not punishment." This statement, which again avoided direct acknowledgement of having murdered her children and instead positioned herself as a victim of circumstance, created visible tension in the courtroom, with Judge Thompson's expression growing increasingly stern as Olivia spoke. Her closing words, "I hope someday people will understand what really happened," struck many as a continued denial of the reality established by the overwhelming evidence presented at trial. Judge Harold Thompson, known for his measured temperament and careful deliberation, appeared visibly affected as he prepared to deliver his sentencing decision, his usual judicial reserve temporarily giving way to an expression of profound moral outrage. In my 37 years on the bench, I have presided over many murder trials, many cases involving unimaginable cruelty, he began, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. But I have rarely encountered a case that so thoroughly exemplifies the calculated elimination of innocent lives for purposes so utterly selfish and trivial. You, Jason Barley and Olivia Smith, deliberately planned and executed the murders of your 3 children, William, Daniel, and Sophia, not in a moment of passion, not under the influence of genuine mental illness, but because you viewed them as obstacles to your desire to party and live without responsibility. Judge Thompson addressed the mental health claims directly, stating, "This court has considered the defense's arguments regarding dissociation and psychological disturbance. However, the evidence presented at trial overwhelmingly demonstrated that your claims of memory loss were fabricated after the fact, that you researched methods of faking amnesia before allegedly experiencing it, and that you maintained clear, goal-directed behavior throughout the planning and execution of these murders. The digital evidence in this case tells a story not of mental breakdown, but of calculated, premeditated, filicide motivated by the most base and selfish of desires to be free of the children you brought into this world because they interfered with your social lives." The judge's contempt was palpable as he continued, "The text messages between you revealed not just planning, but a disturbing lack of empathy or recognition of your children as human beings deserving of life and protection. You referred to them as anchors and spoke of their deaths in terms of the freedom you would gain, a perspective that reveals a moral bankruptcy that this court finds particularly disturbing." Thompson turned his attention specifically to the evidence of chronic neglect that had preceded the murders, noting, "The testimony presented at trial painted a heartbreaking picture of 3 children who were already raising themselves, with 8-year-old William taking on responsibilities that should have been yours. The children's teachers described intelligent, resilient young people who managed to maintain their spirit and potential despite your neglect. The school counselor testified that intervention was just days away, that had you simply abandoned these children, rather than murdering them, they might have had a chance at life with people who would have valued and protected them. That you chose to end their lives rather than allow them this chance speaks to the true nature of your actions, a desire not just to be free of responsibility, but to ensure these children could never testify to how they had been treated." The judge then addressed each defendant individually, beginning with Jason. "Mr. Barley, your attempts to present yourself as remorseful ring hollow in light of your refusal to fully acknowledge your actions even after conviction. Your statement today contained no direct admission of what you did to your children, continuing a pattern of evasion and minimization that suggests you regret being caught far more than you regret taking 3 innocent lives." Turning to Olivia, his tone grew even more severe. "Ms. Smith, your statement today reflected the same self-centeredness that led to these crimes, positioning yourself as a victim rather than acknowledging the true victims in this case, William, Daniel, and Sophia. Your apparent smile when the verdict was read, which many in this courtroom observed, and which the court cameras captured, suggests a disturbing lack of remorse that this court cannot ignore in determining appropriate sentencing." Judge Thompson then delivered the sentences, his voice unwavering. "Jason Barley, on each count of first-degree murder, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively for a total of 3 consecutive life sentences. Olivia Smith, on each count of first-degree murder, you are also sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively for a total of 3 consecutive life sentences." The 150-year effective sentences were among the most severe possible under Georgia law, reflecting both the gravity of the crimes and the judge's assessment of the defendant's lack of remorse or rehabilitation potential. The additional charges of child cruelty, filing a false police report, and obstruction of justice added further years that were largely symbolic given the life sentences, but completed the judicial accounting for every aspect of the defendant's actions. As Judge Thompson announced the sentences, courtroom cameras captured the moment that would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Olivia Smith's face broke into an unmistakable smile, then a brief laugh, quickly suppressed but clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. This shocking display prompted audible gasps from spectators and an immediate sharp reprimand from Judge Thompson, who stated, "Ms. Smith, your inappropriate amusement at this moment only confirms this court's assessment of your character and danger to society. Let the record reflect the defendant's smiling reaction to her sentence." Simultaneously, Jason Barley made a show of covering his face with his hands in an apparent display of emotion, but observers noted that he repeatedly peeked between his fingers to gauge the reaction to his performance, his tears stopping whenever he thought cameras weren't focused on him, a detail that several jurors, still present for the sentencing, visibly registered with expressions of disgust. Judge Harold Thompson, visibly disturbed by Olivia Smith's inappropriate laughter during sentencing and Jason Barley's transparently false display of emotion, added an unprecedented supplemental ruling before concluding the proceedings. The behavior displayed by both defendants during sentencing has reinforced this court's assessment of their profound lack of remorse and the calculated nature of not just their crimes, but their entire approach to these proceedings, Thompson stated, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority rarely so explicitly expressed from the bench. Therefore, in addition to the sentences already imposed, this court orders the following. Both defendants shall be required, as part of their incarceration, to view photographs of their children daily and to listen to recordings of children playing during recreation hours, so that they cannot escape the memory of the lives they chose to extinguish. This extraordinary additional punishment, rooted in the judge's determination that both defendants were attempting to dissociate themselves from the reality of their actions even during sentencing, would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case among legal scholars, with some praising it as innovative justice and others questioning its constitutionality. Judge Thompson concluded the sentencing with a somber reflection that resonated far beyond the courtroom. William, Daniel, and Sophia Barley deserved parents who valued and protected them. Instead, they had parents who viewed them as disposable obstacles to a lifestyle centered on partying and self-indulgence. The tragedy here extends beyond the loss of 3 young lives. It encompasses the failure of multiple systems that should have protected these children from the very people who ultimately killed them. This final statement from the bench shifted focus from the individual defendants to the broader societal failures that had contributed to the children's deaths, foreshadowing the systemic changes that would follow in the case's wake. As court officers led Jason and Olivia away for the last time, their faces now blank and their previous performances abandoned, the historic Savannah courtroom fell silent, the weight of what had transpired there settling over everyone present like the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oaks outside. The aftermath of the Barley Smith case rippled through multiple systems in Georgia and beyond, beginning with a comprehensive investigation into the failures of child protective services that had left William, Daniel, and Sophia vulnerable, despite multiple reports of neglect and concerning behavior. Georgia Governor Rebecca Patel ordered an independent audit of the state's child welfare system, appointing a special task force led by retired Judge Margaret Wilson to examine why 7 separate reports concerning the Barley children had not triggered meaningful intervention. The resulting 127-page report, released in June 2024, identified critical systemic issues, including overwhelming caseloads for social workers, averaging 32 cases per worker, compared to the recommended maximum of 15, fragmented reporting systems that failed to connect related concerns across different reporters, and insufficient legal authority to intervene in cases of neglect without evidence of physical abuse. The Barley-Smith Child Protection Act, signed into law in Georgia in August 2024, implemented sweeping reforms including mandatory case connection across reports concerning the same children, reduced caseloads, increased funding for intervention services, and expanded definitions of neglect that allowed earlier intervention. The criminal justice system's handling of the case also prompted procedural changes, particularly regarding digital evidence collection in suspected domestic homicides. Detective Andre Wilson, whose instinctive focus on the defendant's phones had broken the case open within hours, developed a training program for law enforcement nationwide on digital evidence in family violence cases, emphasizing the importance of immediate device seizure and analysis, even when physical evidence seems to support alternative scenarios. The Savannah Police Department established new protocols requiring digital forensic analysis in all suspected homicides involving family members, regardless of initial scene assessment, a practice soon adopted by departments across Georgia and eventually incorporated into FBI recommendations for domestic homicide investigations. Wilson, promoted to captain following the case, would later reflect in his memoir, Digital Shadows Breaking the Barley-Smith Case, that the parents' phones told the true story while their mouths were still telling lies, a lesson in modern investigation that has fundamentally changed how we approach family violence cases. Mental health professionals engaged in extensive discussion and analysis of the case, particularly regarding the defendant's failed dissociation defense and its potential impact on legitimate mental health defenses in future cases. The American Psychiatric Association convened a special ethics panel to address concerns that the high-profile nature of the case and the clear evidence that Jason and Olivia had researched how to fake symptoms might create increased skepticism toward genuine dissociative disorders in clinical and legal contexts. Their published guidelines, distinguishing genuine from fabricated dissociation in forensic contexts, became a standard reference for mental health professionals providing expert testimony. Dr. Marcia Henderson, whose testimony had been crucial in dismantling the defendant's claims, developed a forensic assessment protocol specifically designed to differentiate genuine dissociative symptoms from malingering, which was adopted by forensic psychology training programs nationwide and credited with preserving the credibility of legitimate mental health defenses while providing tools to identify fabricated claims. The educational community, particularly in Savannah, established lasting memorials to the Barley children that emphasized the potential that had been lost with their deaths. Westside Elementary School, where all three children had attended, created the Barley Children Memorial Library, focusing on books that celebrate resilience, kindness, and the potential of every child regardless of circumstances. Rebecca Thornton, William's third-grade teacher, who had testified so movingly at trial, established a scholarship fund using donations that poured in from around the country after her testimony went viral on social media. The William Barley Future Doctor Scholarship provided financial support for children from disadvantaged backgrounds pursuing medical education, honoring William's stated dream of becoming a doctor to help people who are hurting. Similarly, programs honoring Daniel's artistic talents and Sophia's musical abilities were established, ensuring that the children's potential would continue to be recognized and fostered in other young lives, even as their own had been cut short. Media coverage of the case evolved significantly from the initial reporting of a tragic home invasion to complex analyses of the societal factors that had contributed to the tragedy, including inadequate support for teenage parents, failures in the child welfare system, and the cultural glorification of youthful partying that had formed part of Jason and Olivia's distorted value system, documentary filmmaker Elena Rodriguez produced Three Lost Lights: The Barley Children's Story, which won critical acclaim for its sensitive portrayal of William, Daniel, and Sophia's lives rather than focusing primarily on the sensational aspects of their deaths. The documentary featured interviews with teachers, neighbors, and community members who had known the children, creating a portrait of three resilient, loving siblings who had cared for each other in the absence of parental protection. Rodriguez's deliberate choice not to include any footage of Jason or Olivia, instead representing them only through their text messages displayed on screen, was widely praised as an ethical approach that denied them the notoriety they had seemingly sought while centering the true victims of the case. The legal aftermath for Jason and Olivia unfolded as they began serving their consecutive life sentences in separate maximum security facilities. Their appeals, filed in April 2024, focused primarily on challenging Judge Thompson's unusual supplemental punishment requiring them to view photographs of their children daily and listen to recordings of children playing during recreation hours. The Georgia Court of Appeals upheld the sentences in November 2024, ruling that, while unusual, the supplemental requirements fell within the judge's discretion given the exceptional circumstances of the case and did not constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The court's opinion specifically cited the defendant's behavior during sentencing as justification for the measures, stating, "The trial court reasonably determined that these defendants' lack of remorse and apparent dissociation from the reality of their crimes warranted measures designed to prevent such continued psychological evasion of responsibility." This ruling established a precedent that several other states would later reference in cases involving particularly callous killers who showed no remorse for their actions. Prison officials reported striking differences in how Jason and Olivia adapted to incarceration. Jason initially attempted to present himself to other inmates as someone wrongfully convicted, claiming he had been set up by Olivia and had no memory of harming his children due to being drugged. This narrative quickly collapsed when other inmates gained access to news coverage of the trial, including his damning text messages, leading to his isolation for his own protection after threats from prisoners offended by his crimes against children. Jason subsequently retreated into a pattern of compliance and withdrawal, participating minimally in prison programs and rarely speaking about his case. In contrast, Olivia reportedly embraced her notoriety, collecting news clippings about the case and appearing to enjoy the attention from true crime enthusiasts who attempted to correspond with her. Prison psychologists documented her consistent lack of empathy or remorse, noting that she referred to her children in the third person as those kids rather than by name or with any acknowledgement of her relationship to them, a pattern of psychological distancing that continued to suggest the absence of genuine maternal attachment or remorse for her actions. The grandparents of the Barley children, elderly and previously unaware of the extent of neglect their great-grandchildren had suffered, emerged from the shadows of the case to establish a foundation dedicated to strengthening connections between grandparents and at-risk grandchildren. Jason's grandmother, Eleanor Barley, speaking publicly for the first time at the Foundation's launch in May 2024, expressed profound regret for the family's failure to maintain contact with Jason and recognized the danger the children were in. "We didn't know our own great-grandchildren, and that will haunt us for the rest of our lives. If we had stayed connected, if we had insisted on being present, perhaps William, Daniel, and Sophia might still be alive today." The Barley Grandparents Connection Foundation established programs specifically designed to help elderly grandparents overcome transportation, technological, and financial barriers to maintaining relationships with grandchildren in potentially unstable households, recognizing that extended family connections can provide critical support and oversight for vulnerable children. The case sparked national conversations about teenage parenthood and the inadequacy of support systems for young parents, particularly those without family support networks or financial resources. Social policy experts pointed to the Barley-Smith case as a tragic example of what can happen when teenage parents are simultaneously expected to take on full adult responsibilities while being denied the resources and support needed to succeed in those roles. Several states implemented enhanced support programs specifically targeting young parents, including priority access to child care subsidies, specialized parenting education, mental health services, and educational support to allow young parents to complete their education while caring for their children. These programs, collectively known as Young Family Success Initiatives, represented a significant shift from punitive approaches to teenage parenthood toward more supportive models designed to ensure both young parents and their children could thrive despite challenging circumstances. Law schools across the country incorporated the Barley-Smith case into their criminal law curricula, using it to explore multiple complex issues, including digital evidence in criminal cases, the evolution of mental health defenses, judicial discretion in sentencing, and the intersection of child welfare and criminal justice systems. Harvard Law School professor Jonathan Reynolds developed a comprehensive case study titled Texts, Lies, and Murder: The Barley-Smith Case and Modern Criminal Justice, which became standard reading in criminal law programs nationwide. The case study examined how digital evidence had transformed the investigation and trial, providing students with the full collection of text messages, search histories, and social media posts that had formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, alongside defense strategies and judicial rulings that collectively illustrated the evolving nature of criminal evidence in the digital age. As the first anniversary of the children's deaths approached in September 2024, the Savannah community organized a memorial service in Forsyth Park, where 3 magnolia trees were planted in memory of William, Daniel, and Sophia. The ceremony, attended by hundreds of community members, including the children's teachers, neighbors, and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, focused not on the manner of their deaths, but on celebrating the brief lives they had lived and the legacy they had left behind. Rebecca Thornton, speaking on behalf of the educators who had known the children, captured the sentiment that had come to define how the community chose to remember them. William, Daniel, and Sophia showed us what resilience looks like, what love between siblings can accomplish even in the hardest circumstances, and how the human spirit can shine despite shadows all around. The tragedy is not just that they died, but that the world lost the remarkable adults they were already becoming at such young ages. We honor them not by dwelling on how they were taken from us, but by ensuring that the changes made in their names protect other children facing similar challenges. The Barley-Smith case ultimately left a complex legacy that extended far beyond the courtroom where Jason and Olivia had been sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in prison. The case had exposed critical failures in systems designed to protect vulnerable children, prompted meaningful reforms across multiple institutions, and sparked important conversations about parenthood, responsibility, and the value society places on children's lives. In Savannah, the 3 magnolia trees planted in Forsyth Park would grow over the decades that followed, their branches reaching toward the sky draped in Spanish moss. Silent sentinels representing lives cut short but not forgotten, and in classrooms, courtrooms, and child welfare offices across the country, the names William, Daniel, and Sophia Barley would continue to be invoked not only as victims of a terrible crime, but as catalysts for change that would protect countless other children from similar fates, a legacy of hope emerging from unimaginable tragedy, ensuring that 3 young lives lost would continue to make a difference in the world they had left behind.